With her red lines now in tatters, will she now back the view of UK food producers and back close alignment to the single market to secure their industry? After all, she promised at Chequers there would be frictionless trade.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that the deal that we have negotiated includes access to the European Union on the basis of no tariffs? Might help if he'd actually read it.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, it was a former DEFRA secretary, the member for North Shropshire, who was campaigning to leave in the referendum and actually said during that, and I quote, because it's not the kind of language I would use, only a madman would actually leave the single market. The Prime Minister has previously said you can't just reject no deal, you need to be for something. So with her own deal now so decisively rejected, can we be informed by the Prime Minister what is she now for? Does she now recognise the Labour alternative, the 5 pillars we put forward, is the credible show in town, available and ready to be negotiated? Isn't it time she moved on from her red lines and faced the reality of the situation she has got herself, her party, this Parliament and this country into?
Prime Minister!
The gentleman talks about not wanting no deal, yet repeatedly votes in a way that brings no deal closer. Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, the deal that he's proposing actually has been rejected several times by this House. I may not have my own voice, but I do understand the voice of the country. They want...
The House must calm itself. I want to hear what the Prime Minister has to say and what everybody has to say, and it should not be necessary for voices to be raised for a member to be heard. The Prime Minister.
And that is, people want to leave the EU, they want to end free movement, they want to have our own trade policy, they want to ensure laws are made in this country and judged in our courts. That's what the deal delivers. That's what I continue to work to deliver. He used to believe that too. Why is he just trying to frustrate it?
Jeremy Corbyn!
Speaker, I do have sympathy with the Prime Minister's voice and I hope it soon recovers. I understand how painful this is. The Prime Minister's deal has failed. She no longer has the ability to lead. This is a rudderless government in the face of a huge national crisis. The honourable member for Broxbourne recognised it, saying, and I quote, "The government is not fit for purpose. We're not doing what we need to do, which is govern the country properly and effectively." Where the Prime Minister has so obviously failed, this House needs to listen to the country. Listen to unions, listen to people in work fearful for their future, manufacturers and businesses, workers and European Union citizens who've made such a fantastic contribution to our society, and British citizens across Europe, all facing uncertainty, jobs and industry at risk, the country in crisis. She needs now to show leadership. So can the Prime Minister tell us exactly what her plan is now?
The Prime Minister!
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I continue to believe that the House today will have an opportunity to vote on no deal. They will then have an opportunity tomorrow, depending on how they voted tonight, to vote on the question of the extension of Article 50. And as I said last night, there will be hard choices for this House, but this House will need to determine what its view is on the way forward. As far as the government is concerned, we want to continue to work to leave the European Union. That's what we deliver for the people on the vote of the referendum. We will continue to work to deliver leaving of the European Union, but to deliver leaving the European Union with a good deal. And as regards the right honourable gentleman, he doesn't agree with government policy. He doesn't even agree with Labour Party policy. He has nothing to offer this country.
Andrew Rosindale!
20 points behind.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to send its condolences to the families of the recent victims of knife crime, including the 17-year-old Jodie Chesney, who was tragically murdered in my borough of Havering. But when 2/3 of those carrying a knife escape custodial sentence, and when 1 in 5 repeat offenders avoid prison, what assurances will the Prime Minister give that we are serious about getting tough on knife crime? And does she understand why so many people are fed up with soft sentencing?
Now, can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, that I'm sure that members from across the whole House will want to join me in sending my deepest sympathies and condolences to the family and friends of Jodie. And I know there's nothing that we can do or say that is going to ease the pain that the family are going through at her loss. Can I say to my honourable friend that we are very clear that judges must have the powers they need to impose tough sentences on those involved in serious violence and knife crime. The law already provides for a mandatory prison sentence for a second offence of carrying a knife, and conviction of a knife or offensive weapon offence is now more likely to result in some form of custodial sentence, and for longer than at any point in the last 10 years. Obviously, individual sentencing decisions are a matter for the courts, but we are catching and prosecuting more people who carry a knife. Those who are convicted are now more likely to go to prison and for longer. But as I set out in Prime Minister's questions last week, both I and the Home Secretary are working to see what more we can do to deal with the serious violence and the knife crime that has beset so many of our communities.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister of the tragedy in Ethiopia and the tragic loss of life? And of course, on this day we commemorate the sad loss of the 16 young children and their school teacher in Dunblane that were cruelly cut down by Thomas Hamilton. And of course that sanctity of young life is something that we remember today when we hear the news that the Honourable Member for Murray and his wife Crystal gave birth to a young son, and I'm sure the whole House will want to congratulate him. Mr. Speaker, a no deal will result in unprecedented harm. Does the Prime Minister really want to be the first Prime Minister in history to deliberately plunge the United Kingdom economy into recession?
First of all, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I'm pleased to add my congratulations to my honourable friend, the honourable member for Murray, and his wife on the birth of their son. Can I also say to the right honourable gentleman that I'm sure the thoughts of the whole House are with him in remembering the terrible events that took place in Dunblane and the terrible loss of young life that we saw when that happened. And then can I finally say to the right honourable gentleman, he will of course hear the spring statement from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, in a short time. I'm pleased to say that will show the strength of the United Kingdom economy, the strength of the United Kingdom economy of which Scotland is able to participate as a member of the UK.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, in 16 days, the United Kingdom runs a risk of crashing out of the European Union with a no deal. And we know from the government's own analysis that that will crash the economy. Why doesn't the Prime Minister show some leadership today, do the right thing, and whip all her MPs to take no deal off the table on the 29th of March and forever?
Prime Minister.
You can only take no deal off the table by doing one of two things. Revoke Article 50. Revoke Article 50, which means betraying the vote of the referendum, or agree a deal. If the right honourable gentleman wants to take no deal off the table, he should have voted for the deal.
Lightwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As our honourable friend, the member for Romford, said, nearly a fifth of people convicted for a second or subsequent time of possessing an illegal knife are spared a prison sentence. We would not accept this for firearm offences. Will the Prime Minister look again at sentencing guidelines and sentencing practice to ensure that anyone carrying an offensive weapon gets the sentence they deserve?
Well, again, I say to my honourable friend that I fully appreciate the concern that he and our honourable friend, the member for Rossendale, and others across this House have shown on this issue. The most recent statistics show that 82% of offenders received a custodial sentence for repeat possession offences. Obviously, as I said, sentencing decisions are a matter for the courts. But we do, as a government, regularly look at ensuring that the powers are there to ensure that tough sentences can be imposed on those who are involved in knife crime.
Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker. On Friday, some of the excellent head teachers in my constituency sent letters home with their pupils detailing to parents how their budgets have been slashed by 8% and they're struggling to make ends meet. They've asked on three separate occasions since September 2018 for a meeting with the Secretary of State for Education to discuss school shortages in Kent and have been refused. So can the Prime Minister please ask him to meet with Ms Spinks, Ms Hines, Mr Wright, Mr Cooper, Ms Butcher, Ms Nope, Mr Pywell and others as a matter of urgency?
Yeah. Prime Minister!
Well, I'm sure I will ensure that ministers in the Department for Education have heard the request that the Honourable Lady has put forward. But just to remind her and members of this House, the school's budget this year is £42 billion. That is the highest school budget ever.
Order! The Honourable Member for Yardley is usually advocating good and respectful behaviour, which she must now herself exemplify, notwithstanding her passion or insistence upon her point of view, in which she is not exceptional. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The school's budget is the highest ever this year, and we've given every local authority more money for every pupil in every school this year.
Mr Peter Bow!
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think the whole House could unite in agreeing that the Prime Minister has put an enormous amount of hard work and energy in trying to resolve the European Union issue. And we certainly wish her well and get better soon. Has the Prime Minister had the opportunity to look at Amendment F on the order paper today, proposed by my right honourable friend from Ashford, the former Deputy Prime Minister, signed by many Conservative Remainer MPs and Conservative Labour MPs, by the leader of the DUP and members of the Labour Party? I believe that, Mr Speaker, would unite the Conservative benches and would the Prime Minister and attract support from the opposition benches. Prime Minister, have you had an opportunity to consider whether you would be able to support that amendment?
Can I say
Prime Minister!
To my honourable friend, and I'm grateful to my right honourable and honourable friends for the spirit in which they've sought to broker compromise in this House. The amendment has 4 propositions within it. The first is that we should publish our Day 1 tariff schedules. We've done so this morning. The second, that we should seek to extend the Article 50 process. We remain committed to giving the House the opportunity to debate and vote on this tomorrow. The third, that we should unilaterally guarantee the rights of EU citizens resident in the UK. I'm pleased to reconfirm that we have done this. And the fourth is to seek to negotiate an implementation period in return for a financial payment, but without the withdrawal agreement that we've agreed. The EU have made it clear there will be no agreement without a withdrawal agreement, and that includes what we've already negotiated on citizens' rights, a financial settlement and a Northern Ireland protocol. The plan that exists, that has been agreed, is obviously the deal that was put to the House and rejected by the House last night. But as I say, the EU have made clear that they would not accept elements of what is in the current withdrawal agreement without them being in a withdrawal agreement.
J. Platt.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. On Monday, it will mark 40 years since the Gold One mining disaster in the constituency of Lee. It's a disaster which saw the tragic death of 10 miners, which still reverberates throughout our community and affects the families of those involved. Will the Prime Minister send her support for the commemoration service on Sunday and recommit in their honour to increase our work safety standards and provide all the support needed to our ex-mining community?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for raising this issue? I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in sending my deepest sympathies and condolences to the families and friends of those who were affected by this terrible tragedy. I'm pleased to say that our health and safety record for mines has improved greatly since 1979. This improvement has resulted from learning from previous incidents such as the Goldbourne tragedy, and to prevent as far as possible disasters like this. And as the Honourable Lady may know, in 2015, following an extensive review, the mines regulations replaced all previous legislation relating to health and safety in underground mines, and those provide a comprehensive and simple goal-setting legal framework to ensure mine operators provide the necessary protection for mine workers and others from the what we all accept are inherent hazards in mines. But I can assure the Honourable Lady we'll continue to review safety regulations so we can make sure a tragedy like this never happens again.
Shailesh Bara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that no-deal Brexit is the government's default position, will the Prime Minister kindly inform the House that she will instruct the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make available whatever funds are required to ensure that the country is as best prepared as possible in the event that we do leave on a no-deal basis?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, obviously we continue to be working to leave in an orderly fashion with a deal, but we have made funding available. That funding is being used to ensure that we have preparations for a no-deal.
Bridget Phillipson.
The Prime Minister routinely deflects questions on child poverty, insisting on absolute rather than relative measures. Can she assure the House that if the figures published later this month on her own preferred measure of absolute poverty showed that child poverty is rising, that she will at last join those of us calling for a pause to universal credit?
Prime Minister.
I say to the Honourable Lady, I continue to believe, as I have said in this House before, that the best route out of poverty is through work. She refers to figures that I quote. I also do quote the figures, which I have to say I think are very important for this House, of the number of children who, the reduction in the number of children who are living in workless households. And all the evidence is, and there is very clear evidence about how the advantages of children being brought up in a house in which there is work. Universal credit is encouraging work. It is delivering on ensuring that we see more people in work and able to provide for their families.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a former technology entrepreneur, I've seen for myself the barriers that face aspiring women seeking to start up new businesses. And yet we know that £250 billion could be added to the UK economy if women can start and scale up businesses at the same rate as men. So therefore, does the Prime Minister welcome Alison Rose's review into female entrepreneurship, and will she call today for the banks to adopt those recommendations without delay?
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue and for bringing her own successful experience as an entrepreneur into this House. I'm very happy to join her in welcoming Alison Rose's review. We are setting out our ambition to increase the number of female entrepreneurs by half by 2030. We're doing that in various ways, including my honourable friend, the Business Minister, will sponsor an industry-led task force alongside Treasury Ministers that is going to drive forward work to encourage greater investment in female entrepreneurs by all types of finance providers, including the banks.
Last year, 690 children were attacked or threatened with a knife in the West Midlands. Parents are terrified. Police officers across the country agree that there's a link between the knife crime epidemic and the Prime Minister's decision as Home Secretary to cut 20,000 police officers from our streets. Is she the last person standing to deny that link?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady,
Prime Minister.
I set out last week some steps that the government is taking to increase the work we're doing in relation to knife crime. I understand my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, met with the Chief Constable of the West Midlands at the end of last week to discuss policing in the West Midlands. And can I say she refers to decisions that were taken by the government in 2010. Those decisions, yes, led to some difficult decisions in terms of public sector funding, but they were taken because of the appalling set of circumstances in the economy left by Labour.
Order. I understand that the honourable gentleman member for Bexhill and Battle is about to name-check his mother, an admirable woman, a former teacher, and, in my view, very importantly, my constituent, Mr. Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think she loves you more than me these days. Because she's also a Labour supporter. Of course, you are independent. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of me and my lovely mum, there are parts of the country, from Sheffield to Staffordshire to Sussex, where pupils are receiving less money per head than other parts of the country. I know the Prime Minister values a good education because she went to the same school as my mother, who became a teacher. So for me and my lovely mum, three things. more funding for our schools. Secondly, special educational needs, more focused priorities, stopping academies excluding pupils unnecessarily for their targets. And thirdly, lowest funded areas funded first when we get this right. Thank you.
The Prime Minister!
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? I was tempted to start off by saying that I suspect I and his mother were at the school at a different time. But I'm not. Oh, he says it's true. Good, because I wasn't much. In relation, I recognise that we have been asking schools to do more. We've responded with 1.3 billion extra investment going to our schools across this year and next. So the core schools budget will be rising by around 2.6 billion in total, and overall per pupil funding is being protected in real terms by this government. Every school is attracting at least 1% more per pupil by next year, and thousands of schools will attract significantly larger gains of up to 3% per pupil per year. This investment will mean more children having the chance of a better future. But of course, what matters also is the quality of education that is provided. And I would commend my honourable friend's mother, who I understand was a teacher, for the work that she has done in education, and say the thanks from this whole House to all our teachers up and down the country for the work that they do.
Lynn Brown!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I told the Prime Minister a month ago, my constituent Mariam was diagnosed with SMA1 in November of last year when she was just 4 months old. She needs Spinraza now and is likely only to live a few months without it. NICE met last week to discuss it, but cruelly, to date, haven't even announced a decision. Last time the Prime Minister told me to see a minister, I did, and nothing's changed. All I'm asking is for baby Mariam to have the same chance of Spinraza as she would if she lived in Scotland, Germany, Italy, Romania or 20 other European countries. Let me be clear. I'm asking the Prime Minister to intervene. Will she?
Prime Minister!
The Honourable Lady, I'm sure everybody across the whole House obviously is sending our sympathies and our concerns to the family of Mariam. We recognise this must be an incredibly difficult time. Decisions of this matter are rightly taken, not by politicians, but by clinicians. And I understand the Honourable Lady recently met my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary. As she says, NICE did look at the relevant information to this appraisal committee meeting on the 6th of March when it was considering recommendations in relation to this. But it is right that the benefits and the evidence in relation to new medicines are properly considered by the experts in the field, by the clinicians. The Department for Health and Social Care is working with NICE on this issue.
Andrew Griffiths.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent, Nicola Morgan Dingley, is a wife and a mum. She was just 36 when she was diagnosed with triple-negative breast cancer, the most virulent form. Sadly, at 38, Nicola has a terminal diagnosis. She's asked me to ask three things today, Prime Minister. First of all, will you look at publicising the fact that women should never miss a mammogram and how important it is that they attend? Secondly, will she consider lowering the age with which women are able to seek a mammogram so that more women aren't missed out? And thirdly, there are some immunotherapy trials taking place across the country which could potentially offer a lifeline to Nicola. Will she consider expanding those trials so that Nicola can get the help that could save her life?
The Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend that obviously I'm sure the whole House shares his concern for his constituent Nicola, and our sympathies are with her and her family and friends. She asked about three things. In relation to the age at which the screening becomes available or is required, that is a matter that has been looked at previously, and I'm sure this is something that, as we look forward to the long-term plan, will be considered again. But my understanding is that the decision is based on the evidence again about the benefits of these screenings at certain times. He referenced the immunotherapy. The National Institute for Health Research has delivered 64 studies of immunotherapy for women with breast cancer to date. 28 studies are currently open to recruitment and 14 studies are currently in set-up. But I'll ask the Department for Health to respond to him about the specific case of his constituent. And finally, the third point that he raised from Nicola, absolutely right. I would urge all women to attend their mammogram appointments. They're vitally important. They could save your life.
Stephen Hepburn.
Does the Prime Minister not feel guilty that parents and teachers are forced to buy books and pens for schools and heads of cleaning classrooms?
Prime Minister.
The honourable gentleman heard the response I gave earlier. We are putting more money into our schools. We're ensuring that overall per pupil funding is being protected. Yes, we have been asking schools to do more and recognise the pressures that there are on schools, but the government has responded with more funding.
Mr. David Duquette. No, the honourable gentleman. He had previously signalled an interest, and I was trying to accommodate him, but never mind. Yes, very well. Mr. David Tredynick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If my right honourable friend had been elected as leader of the Labour Party, would she be allowing a free vote this evening?
She's not responsible.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I think that actually there are passionately held views on this issue and differences of opinion on this issue, and I think it would be of benefit to the House if there was a free vote across the House.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Sunday, the community of Fair Isle in Shetland suffered a devastating blow when their world-renowned bird observatory was destroyed in a fire. The impact, Mr. Speaker, of something like that on a community of 60 people is absolutely devastating, and they are still coming to terms with it. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking those who have already supported Fair Isle, including the firefighters who tackled the blaze and those who transported them? And will she commit her government today to supporting the community in Fair Isle as they look towards rebuilding what is a globally important research resource so that it can get back into action as soon as possible?
Well, can I
Prime Minister.
Honourable gentleman, I would like to send my deepest sympathies to all those who work in and indeed who visit the observatory, and this will be devastating, as he says, for the local community. And I would like to offer my praise for the work of the local fire and coast guard services for all their efforts in bringing the blaze under control. And I understand investigations are ongoing as to the cause of the fire. If the right honourable gentleman will allow me, this gives me an opportunity also to thank the firefighters who dealt with the fire in my own constituency of Maidenhead yesterday, which took place in Maidenhead town centre. Now, I understand that the building he refers to is comprehensively insured. The owners are not seeking additional funding at this time, but I will ask a minister from the Scotland office to meet with the right honourable gentleman to see whether any further support can be provided.
Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, on the 29th of January, the House and virtually the entire Conservative Party, be they Brexiteer or Remainer alike, voted for the Brady Amendment with the strong encouragement of the government, and Brady was designed to help facilitate the so-called Malthouse Compromise. We don't yet have the Speaker's selection of amendments for the debate, but Prime Minister, if he is minded to select Amendment F, which is the Malthouse Compromise, one, will it be a free vote? And two, how will you personally vote on it?
Can I say to
Prime Minister.
He refers. I referenced in answer to an earlier question from our honourable friend the elements of the Malthouse Amendment, of the amendment that is down that refers to one part of what became known as the Malthouse Compromise, and as I referenced earlier, some of those issues have already been addressed by the government. But he refers to the Brady Amendment, the amendment put down in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale West. That was about alternative arrangements replacing the backstop. Our honourable friend also indicated other ways in which the backstop, concern about the backstop should be dealt with. Of course, what we have agreed in a legally binding character with the European Union is that commitment to ensuring that alternative arrangements are indeed available by the end of December 2020, so that they can do what that amendment required and can replace the backstop.
Mr. Paul Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jodie Whiting was a mother of 9 from Thornaby who died by suicide in 2017. Just before her death, she missed a work capability assessment because of health problems and was sanctioned. The independent case examiner has found multiple and significant failings by the DWP, including 5 missed opportunities to identify that she had mental health problems and properly safeguard her. Her family are asking for an apology and to make sure that this can never happen again to anyone else. Can the Prime Minister offer this?
Minister. Say to the honourable gentleman, he's absolutely right to raise this appalling case that took place, and our thoughts and sympathies are with Miss Whiting's family at this time. As he said, what's been identified is that there were mistakes in handling her case, and he's absolutely right. The Department has apologised for their failings, and they are providing compensation to the family. That, of course, can never bring Miss Whiting back. We obviously need, the point he made is that we need to learn from this case, and that is why absolutely the Department is looking at that case to make sure that we never see these sorts of failings happening again and leading to such a tragic consequence.
Pawsey. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly made a priority to deliver more homes. So will she welcome the great work of pro-growth Rugby Borough Council, which is currently providing new homes at over 3 times the UK average rate, with 739 last year and 860 alone underway, with 4 house builders at Halton?
Prime Minister. So, to my honourable friend, I'm very happy to commend the work of his local council in providing more homes. I think this is very important. I'm also pleased that under this government, last year we saw more homes being built than in any year in the last 30 years, bar one. That is a record that we should be proud of, and obviously his council is very helpfully contributing to that. I'm sure will continue to support the real need to ensure that we have sufficient homes for families up and down this country.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You will know that Western Berkshire has 2 notable anniversaries this week. Today, the 78th anniversary of proportionally the worst aerial bombardment in the history of the United Kingdom, the Clydebank Blitz. I'm sure the Prime Minister would wish to be the first ever British Prime Minister to note it. And secondly, on Monday, my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal will have been incarcerated for 500 days without trial, but have suffered trial by media, sanctioned, some would say, by the Indian state. And I appreciate that ministers are working very hard, but can the Prime Minister now say to their own Foreign Secretary, no guilt has been yet done, there has been no trial, why will they not meet with both myself, the constituency MP, and the family to hear what the impact of this incarceration is having on them?
Prime Minister. First of all, I recognise the point that he made about the aerial bombardment that took place all those many years ago and the impact that that had on the local community. On the specific case, ministers are dealing with this. They have been actively involved in this case. I will ensure, obviously, the Foreign Secretary has heard the request that he has put forward for a specific meeting. I believe one of the ministers is actually dealing with this case and will, I'm sure, be pleased to meet with him.
Finally, Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The media have started calling this place a failing parliament. There was nothing failing about this place 3 weeks ago when we unanimously voted to protect the rights of citizens, British and EU nationals here. Aside from the letter that the Secretary of State has written to Michel Barnier, can the Prime Minister update this House on what she has personally done? For example, has she phoned Merkel and Macron or President Tusk to help protect British citizens in the EU and EU nationals here?
Prime Minister. Yes, I'm happy to tell my honourable friend that I have spoken to a number of EU leaders about the desire that we have for UK citizens in their countries to be fully protected were there a no deal and to be protected on a reciprocal basis. Some countries have already published legislation. We want to make sure that the basis on which they're providing guarantees for UK citizens is on the same basis as we're providing guarantees for EU citizens here.
Thank you. Order.
spring statement, the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely conscious of the fact that the House has other pressing matters on its mind today, and to avoid making this statement any longer than necessary, I'm laying a WMS which contains additional announcements and provides further details of those that I will make. Mr. Speaker, last night's vote leaves a cloud of uncertainty hanging over our economy, and our most urgent task in this House is to lift that uncertainty. But the economy itself is remarkably robust. It has grown for 9 consecutive years, with the longest unbroken quarterly growth run of any G7 economy, and is forecast to continue growing in each of the next 5 years. An economy that has created over 3.5 million net new jobs under Conservative-led government, that has almost halved Labour's shocking legacy of youth unemployment, that has seen female participation in the workforce increase to record levels, and that is now delivering the fastest rate of wage growth in over a decade. An economy that has defied expectations and will provide the solid foundation that Britain needs to seize the opportunities that the future offers. A far cry, I have to say, from the 8 recessions and mass unemployment predicted by the House's very own Nostradamus over there, the Shadow Chancellor. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, not so much an astronomer as a man living in a parallel universe. And thanks to the difficult decisions that we've taken in the last 9 years and the hard work of the British people, I can also report today on public finances that continue to improve, so that provided we do reach a deal to leave the European Union with an orderly transition, and provided we avoid the disaster of a government led by the front bench opposite, this country, for the first time in a decade, will have genuine and sustainable choices about its future. Today's OBR report marks another step on Britain's road out of austerity, and I'd like to thank Robert Choate and his team for their work. Despite the slowing world economy, the OBR expects Britain to continue to grow in every year of the forecast, at 1.2% this year, with both the IMF and the OECD forecasting the UK to grow faster than Germany. Then 1.4% in 2020, as forecast at the budget, and 1.6% in each of the final 3 years. Cumulative growth over the 5 years now slightly higher than the budget forecast. Meanwhile, Britain's remarkable job story is set to continue. By 2023, the OBR expect to see 600,000 more new jobs in our economy. And despite the constant attempts from the opposition front bench to talk down our remarkable achievement on jobs, the fact, Mr. Speaker, is this. Last year, 96% of new jobs were full-time. And there's positive news on pay too, with the OBR revising up wage growth to 3% or higher in every year. And with inflation now around the target throughout the forecast period, that means real wage growth in every year of the forecast. A growing economy, a thriving labour market, inflation on target, Mr. Speaker, a solid foundation on which to build Britain's future. And there's good news on the public finances too. Borrowing this year will be just 1.1% of GDP, £3 billion lower than forecast at the autumn budget, and a staggering £130 billion lower than in the last year of the Labour government. But what is really staggering, Mr. Speaker, is that the Shadow Chancellor's critique of that government is that it didn't spend enough. Looking forward, borrowing will fall from £29.3 billion in 2019-20 then 21.2 billion, 17.6 billion, 14.4 billion, and finally £13.5 billion in 23-24, its lowest level in 22 years. We remain on track to meet both our fiscal targets early, with the cyclically adjusted deficit at 1.3% next year, falling to just 0.5% by 2023-24, and with headroom against our fiscal mandate in 2021 increasing from £15.4 billion at the autumn budget to £26.6 billion today. Less borrowing means less debt, now lower in every year than forecast at the budget, falling to 82.2% of GDP next year, then 79%, 74.9%, 74%, and finally 73% in 23-24. Our national debt falling sustainably for the first time in a generation. Mr. Speaker, a major milestone on the road out of the crisis we inherited from Labour, and a key dividing line today between a shadow Chancellor whose plans would send debt soaring above 100% of GDP, and a Conservative government committed to delivering world-class public services and keeping our national debt falling. Since 2010, we've been steering the country on a journey of recovery from Labour's recession. Back then, the most important task was to get borrowing down to manageable levels. But when I became Chancellor in 2016, I recognised that with the progress we'd already made, as well as getting Britain's debt down, our continued success as a nation would depend on investing in our future, supporting our vital public services and keeping taxes low to attract talent and investment. I called it a balanced approach, and it is delivering, with the highest sustained levels of public capital investment in 40 years, cuts in income tax for more than 30 million people in 3 weeks' time, cuts that they voted against, Mr. Speaker, and debt on a sustained downward path for the first time in a generation. I've made over £150 billion of new spending commitments since 2016, and at the budget I announced that the long but necessary squeeze on current public spending would come to an end at the upcoming spending review, setting out an indicative 5-year path of 1.2% per annum real terms increases in day-to-day spending on public services, compared to real terms cuts of 3% per annum announced at SR 2010 and 1.3% cuts at SR 15. We've made our biggest choice on public spending, putting the NHS first in line, as the British public would expect, with my right honourable friend the Prime Minister's announcement of £34 billion of additional funding per year by the end of the period, the single largest cash commitment ever made by a peacetime British government to support our long-term plan for the NHS, delivering, Mr. Speaker, improved cancer and mental health care, a transformation of GP services, more doctors, more nurses and better outcomes for patients. Now we need to address wider departmental spending for the next review period. So I can confirm today that, assuming a Brexit deal is agreed over the next few weeks and the uncertainty that is hanging over our economy is lifted, I intend to launch a full 3-year spending review before the summer recess, to be concluded alongside an autumn budget. It will set departmental budgets beyond the NHS to reflect the public's priorities between areas like social care, local government, schools, police, defence and the environment. And it will maximise value for taxpayers' money through a renewed focus on delivering high-quality outcomes. And if we leave the EU with a deal and an orderly transition to a future economic partnership, we will see a deal dividend, an economic boost from recovery in business confidence and investment, and a fiscal boost from a reduction in the minimum necessary level of fiscal headroom once the risk of a no-deal exit is removed.
giving us as a nation real choices as we use the spending review to decide how much of this deal dividend we can prudently release and how we would share it between increased spending on public services, capital investment in Britain's future prosperity and keeping taxes low, while always continuing to keep our debt falling. Real terms increases in public spending, record investment in Britain's future, more jobs than ever before, higher wages and lower taxes meaning increased take-home pay, and for the first time in a generation, our debt going down. That, Mr. Speaker, is what I mean by an end to austerity delivered by a Conservative government. But, Mr. Speaker, the progress we have made will be at risk if we cannot secure a smooth and orderly exit from the EU and a transition to a new partnership that protects the complex trading relationships businesses have built up over 45 years and on which so many British jobs depend. I hoped we would do that last night, but I'm confident that we, as a House, will do it over the coming weeks. Leaving with no deal would mean significant disruption in the short and medium term, and a smaller, less prosperous economy in the long term than if we leave with a deal. Higher unemployment, lower wages, higher prices in the shops. That is not what the British people voted for in June 2016, which is why all of us have a solemn duty in the days and weeks ahead to put aside our differences and seek a compromise on which this House can agree in the national interest. But government also has a duty to plan for every reasonably foreseeable contingency, and we have done so. First, we have plans in place to minimise disruption to our financial system, and the Bank of England judges that it is resilient to any likely no-deal shock. Second, we've worked across Whitehall to put in place mitigations at our border, although we cannot regulate how the EU would operate its border in a no-deal exit. Third, we've published today our temporary UK no-deal tariff schedule, carefully balancing the needs of producers and consumers in the context of the pressures the no-deal economy would face. And fourth, the Treasury and the Bank of England together have all the tools of fiscal and monetary policy available to us, including the fiscal headroom I have held in reserve. But I need to be straight with the House. A no-deal Brexit would deliver a significant short to medium-term reduction in the productive capacity of the British economy. And because our economy is operating at or near full capacity, any fiscal and monetary response would have to be carefully calibrated not to simply cause inflation, compounding the effect of any movement in the exchange rate on the price of goods in our shops. And while fiscal and monetary intervention might help to smooth our path to a post-Brexit economy, both could only be temporary, and neither would allow us to avoid the effects of a relatively smaller economy nor the pain of restructuring. So the idea that there is some simple, readily available fix that can be deployed to avoid the consequences of a no-deal Brexit is, I'm afraid, just wrong. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that we are going to do a deal. And when we do, the British people will fully expect us to fire up our economic plan to seize the opportunities as confidence in our economy returns. But it isn't just the spectre of uncertainty that we need to overcome if we're to restore confidence and unlock a brighter future. Because while we on this side of the House will always be the party of business, and small business especially, Mr. Speaker, we will always be the party of business. But the Shadow Chancellor identifies business as the enemy. A government led by the Leader of the Opposition would chill the very marrow of our economy, destroying jobs and stifling innovation. And those are not my words, Mr. Speaker. They're the words of the former Labour member for Penistone and Stocksbridge. And she is right. So our task is to demonstrate to the British people that working with business through the mechanism of a well-regulated market economy, our plan will deliver a brighter future for them, so that they are never ever tempted by the empty promises and dangerous rhetoric of the front bench opposite. A plan which makes the most of the opportunities ahead as we make our own way, independent from, but in continuing partnership with the European Union. A plan to embrace the technologies of the future and equip British workers to use them. To back the enterprise and ambition of British business. To support our world-leading entrepreneurs, creators and innovators, inventors and discoverers. To build on the UK's fundamental strengths and competitive advantages so that we can slay once and for all the twin demons of low productivity and low wages and build an economy that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, the only sustainable path to higher wages and rising living standards is to boost productivity. And to do that, we're investing in infrastructure, skills, technology and housing under our plan for Britain's future, with £37 billion in the National Productivity Investment Fund, the largest ever investment in England's strategic roads, the biggest rail investment programme since Victorian times, and a strategy for delivering a nationwide full fibre network by 2033. At SR19, we will set multi-year capital budgets following a zero-based review, protecting our record levels of capital spending while ensuring that investment is focused to deliver the greatest impact on productivity. And our investment strategy is benefiting the whole of the UK. I can announce today up to £260 million for the innovative Borderlands Growth Deal, covering the border regions of England and Scotland, on top of the £100 million HIF funding already announced for Carlisle. Negotiations are progressing on future deals for Mid Wales and Derry Londonderry, and I reiterate today this government's commitment to the Northern Powerhouse Rail project and look forward to considering TfN's business case ahead of the spending review. We will publish the updated National Infrastructure Strategy alongside the spending review, and I'm publishing today a consultation on our approach to supporting private infrastructure investment once we leave the European Investment Bank and now that we've retired Labour's discredited PFI. But raising our productivity isn't just about investing in physical capital, it's also about investing in people. The Auger Review will be published shortly and will represent an important contribution to our overall plan for post-18 education. The government will respond later in the year. We're committed to returning technical and vocational skills to the heart of our educational system, with the new T-level system on track to deliver the first 3 routes in 2020, the first phase of the National Retraining Scheme starting this summer, and the apprenticeship programme rolling out 3 million new high-quality apprenticeships. And to help small businesses take on more apprentices, I can announce that I am bringing forward the £700 million package of reforms I announced at the budget to the start of the new financial year in April. The productivity agenda is, above all, about increasing the wages of the lowest paid, and the pay of a full-timer on national minimum wage has risen by £2,750 a year since 2016. We've confirmed the Low Pay Commission's remit for the national living wage to reach 60% of median earnings by 2020. But later this year, we will need to set a new remit beyond 2020. We want to be ambitious, driving productivity across the income distribution with the ultimate objective of ending low pay in the UK. But we also want to take care to protect employment opportunities for lower paid workers. So we've asked Professor Arun Dubey, a world-leading expert in the field, to undertake a review of the international evidence on the employment and productivity effects of minimum wage rates. This study will support the extensive discussions that we'll be having with employer organisations, trades unions and the LPC itself over the coming months, starting with a roundtable which I will chair next month. So, Mr. Speaker, while the opposition frontbench grandstands, this Conservative government is delivering sustainable pay rises for millions of British workers. Mr. Speaker, alongside our commitment to give British workers the skills they need is a commitment to maintaining the openness of our economy to talent from around the world. As we leave the EU, free movement of people will end, and we will take back control of our borders. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has set out a framework for a future immigration system in the Immigration White Paper, focused on attracting those with the skills we need in the UK economy, no matter where they come from. We've committed to consulting with business to ensure that the new system supports the needs of our economy. And as we do so, I can announce that from June, we will begin to abolish the need for paper landing cards at UK points of entry, and we will allow citizens of the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Singapore and South Korea to start using e-gates at our airports and Eurostar terminals, alongside the EEA nationals who can already use them. And, Mr. Speaker, our ambition is to be able to go further in due course, a signal to the world of our commitment to global Britain. Another key pillar of our plan is backing Britain to remain at the forefront of the technology revolution that is transforming our economy. And to support that ambition, from this autumn, we will completely exempt PhD-level roles from the visa caps. Since 2016, we've launched our modern industrial strategy and committed an additional £7 billion to science and innovation, clear progress towards our target of total R&D spending reaching 2.4% of the economy. But technology does not stand still, and neither can we. So to maintain the UK's technological edge, we will invest £79 million in Archer 2, a new supercomputer to be hosted at Edinburgh University. I'm told that it is up to 5 times faster than the current generation of supercomputers, capable of a staggering 10,000 trillion calculations per second. And I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that with the right algorithms it might even be able to come up with a solution to the backstop. I'm allocating £45 million of NPIF funding to the European Bioinformatics Institute, ensuring Britain's continued lead in genomics research. I will guarantee our commitment to the UK's funding for the Jet Nuclear Fusion Reactor, whatever happens with Brexit, and invest £81 million in a new extreme photonics centre in Oxfordshire to develop new types of laser, literally the cutting edge of technology, Mr. Speaker. Sorry about that. The digital economy presents enormous opportunities, but enormous challenges as well. I've already responded to concerns about unfairness in the tax system with a new digital services tax so that digital platform companies pay their fair share. But we also need to adapt our regulatory environment to ensure competition works for consumers in the digital marketplace as it does in the real marketplace. I asked Professor Jason Furman, Barack Obama's former chief economist, to review competition in the digital marketplace, and I welcome his report, which is published today. He sets out far-reaching recommendations, including new powers for consumers and an overall overhaul of competition regulation, updating our regulatory model for the digital age. And as a first step towards implementing reforms, I am asking the Competition and Markets Authority to undertake a market study of the digital advertising market as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, the UK will remain a great place to do digital business, but it will be a place where successful global tech giants pay their fair share, where competition policy works in consumers' interests, and where the public are protected from online harms. Under this government, Britain will lead the world in delivering a digital economy that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House and many on the backbenches opposite understand that a well-regulated market economy is the best, indeed the only, way to deliver a brighter future for our country. Our challenge is to demonstrate to the next generation that our market economy can fulfil their aspirations and speak to their values. So before I finish, I want to talk about two subjects dear to them: housing and the environment. Last year, housing delivery exceeded 220,000 additional homes, the highest level in all but one of the last 31 years. Mr. Speaker, our ambitious plan to restore the dream of home ownership to millions of younger people is already delivering. Planning reform to release land in areas where the pressure is greatest, a 5-year £44 billion housing programme to help raise annual housing supply to 300,000 by the mid-2020s, the Help to Buy equity loan scheme, abolition of stamp duty for first-time buyers, which has so far helped 240,000 people onto the property ladder, and restored the proportion of first-time buyers to above 50% for the first time in a generation. And today, I can announce a new £3 billion affordable homes guarantee scheme to support delivery of around 30,000 affordable homes, the launch next month of the £1 billion Enable Build SME Guarantee Fund that I announced at budget, and £717 million from the Housing Infrastructure Fund to unlock up to 37,000 new homes on sites in West London, Cheshire, Didcot and Cambridge, the latter two being at opposite ends of the Oxford-Cambridge arc, for which I am publishing a new vision statement today. Mr. Speaker, as with the challenge of adapting to the digital age, so with the challenge of shaping the carbon-neutral economy of the future, we must apply the creativity of the marketplace to deliver solutions to one of the most complex problems of our time, climate change, and build sustainability into the heart of our economic model. The UK is already leading the world, reducing the carbon intensity of our economy faster than any other G20 country, with ambitious and legally binding targets for the future. Today, I can announce our next steps. First, we will publish a call for evidence on whether all passenger carriers should be required to offer genuinely additional carbon offsets, so that customers who want zero carbon travel have that option and can be confident about additionality. Second, we will help small businesses cut their carbon emissions and their energy bills, publishing today a call for evidence on the Business Energy Efficiency Scheme that I announced at the budget. Third, we will publish proposals to require an increased proportion of green gas in the grid, advancing decarbonisation of our mains gas supply. And finally, we will introduce a future homes standard mandating the end of fossil fuel heating systems in all new houses from 2025. Mr. Speaker, delivering lower carbon and lower fuel bills too. But, Mr. Speaker, climate change is not our only environmental challenge. We are already consulting on new tax and regulatory measures to tackle the scourge of plastic waste, defacing our countryside and choking our oceans. Now, for the first time in 60 million years, the number of species worldwide is in sustained mass decline. The UK's 1,500 species of pollinators deliver an estimated £680 million annual value to our economy. So there's an economic as well as an environmental case for protecting the diversity of the natural world. So following consultation, the government will use the forthcoming Environment Bill to mandate biodiversity net gain for development in England. ensuring that the delivery of much-needed infrastructure and housing is not at the expense of vital biodiversity. But this is a global problem, Mr. Speaker, so later this year the UK Government will launch a comprehensive global review of the link between biodiversity and economic growth, to be led by Professor Sapatha Dasgupta, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Cambridge. We in this House, Mr. Speaker, should be proud that the UK, with its overseas territories, has already declared more than 3 million square kilometres of marine protected area. And today, I can announce our intention to designate a further 445,000 square kilometres of ocean around Ascension Island as marine protected area. This Conservative government taking action today on our pledge to be the first in history to leave our environment in better condition than we found it. Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, I have 3 further short announcements to make. First, in response to rising concern by head teachers that some girls are missing school attendance due to inability to afford sanitary products, I have decided to fund the provision of free sanitary products in secondary schools and colleges in England from the next school year. I congratulate those honourable members who have campaigned on this issue on all sides of the House, and my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, will announce further details in due course. Second, I announced a year ago that we would take definitive action to tackle the scourge of late payments for our small businesses. A full response to last year's call for evidence will be published shortly, but I can announce today that as a first step, we will require company audit committees to review payment practices and report on them in their annual accounts. My right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will announce further details in due course, and I congratulate the FSB in particular on its tireless campaign on this issue. And third, Mr. Speaker, the recent surge in knife crime represents a personal tragedy for the scores of families of victims, and I know I can speak for the whole House when I offer my deepest sympathies to them. We must and we will stamp out this menace. Police funding is due to rise by up to £970 million from April. Many police and crime commissioners have already committed to using this extra funding to recruit and train additional police officers. But that takes time, and action is needed now. So the Prime Minister and I have decided, exceptionally, to make available immediately to police forces in England an additional £100 million over the course of the next year, ring-fenced to pay for additional overtime, targeted specifically on knife crime and for new violent crime reduction units to deliver a wider cross-agency response to this epidemic. Ahead of the spending review, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will work with the police to consider how best to prioritise resources going forward, including newly funded manpower, to ensure a lasting solution to the problem. Mr. Speaker, to be frank, last night's events mean we are not where I hoped we would be today. Our economy is fundamentally robust, but the uncertainty I hoped we would lift last night still hangs over it. We cannot allow that to continue. It is damaging our economy and it is damaging our standing and reputation in the world. Tonight, we have a choice. We can remove the threat of an imminent no-deal exit hanging over our economy. Tomorrow, we will have the opportunity to start to map out a way forward towards building a consensus across this House for a deal we can collectively support to exit the EU in an orderly way, to a future relationship that will allow Britain to flourish, protecting jobs and businesses. We have huge opportunities ahead of us. Our capital is the world's financial centre. Our universities are global powerhouses of discovery and innovation. Our businesses are at the cutting edge of the tech revolution. And we have shown that we are not shy as a nation of the tasks that lie ahead. We're addressing the environmental challenges that threaten our planet. We're building the homes that the next generation desperately need. We're investing in our future, tackling the productivity gap and embracing technological change, rising to its challenges and seizing its opportunities. Our potential is clear. Our advantages are manifest. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, a proud, successful, outward-looking nation with no limit to our ambition and no boundaries to what we can achieve. A brighter future is within our grasp. Tonight, let's take a decisive step towards seizing it and building a Britain fit for the future, a Britain the next generation will be proud to call their home. I commend this statement to the House.
John McDonnell!
Let me thank the Chancellor for providing me with an early sight of his statements, no matter how heavily redacted. We have just witnessed a display by the Chancellor of this government's toxic mix of callous complacency over austerity and its grotesque incompetence over the handling of Brexit. Whilst teachers are having to pay for the materials their pupils need, working parents are struggling to manage as schools close early and their children are sent home. 5,000 of our fellow citizens will be sleeping in the cold and wet on the streets tonight. Young people are being stabbed to death in rising numbers. And the Chancellor turns up today with no real end or reversal of austerity and to threaten us, because this is what he means, that austerity can only end if we accept this government's bad deal over Brexit. Let's look at some of the claims this Chancellor has made. The Chancellor has boasted about the OBR forecast of 1.2% growth this year. What he hasn't mentioned is that this has been downgraded from 1.6%. And downgrading forecasts is a pattern under this Chancellor. In November 2016, forecasts for the following year were downgraded from 2.2% to 1.4%. In the autumn 2017, forecasts for the following year were downgraded from 1.6% to 1.4%. As you know, economists are warning that what little growth there is in this economy is largely being sustained by consumption based upon high levels of household debt. And on the public finances, the Chancellor is boasting about bringing down debt. Let's remind him that when Labour left office, having had to bail out his friends in the city, many of them Tory donors, the nation's debt stood at £1 trillion. They have borrowed for failure, and they've added another £750 billion to the debt since then. More than any Labour government ever. On the deficit, he's boasting about the deficit. He has not eliminated the deficit as we were promised by 2015. He simply shifted it. He's shifted it onto the shoulders of head teachers, NHS managers, local councillors and police commissioners. And worst of all, onto the backs of many of the poorest in our society. And the consequences are stark. Infant mortality has increased. Life expectancy has reduced. And our communities, yes, are less safe. Police budgets have faced a cut of £2.7 billion since 2010, and nothing the Chancellor has said today will make up for the human and economic consequences of those cuts. The Chancellor talks about a balanced approach. There's nothing balanced about a government giving over £110 billion of tax cuts to the rich and corporations, whilst 87 people a day die before they receive the care they need. The number of children coming into care has increased every year for 9 years. And benefit freezes and the rollout of universal credit are forcing people into food banks to survive. I'll give him a quote. Sending a message to the poorest and most vulnerable in our society that we do not care. The honourable member quoted was referring to the tax credits in 2015. The honourable member for South Cambridgeshire. The number of pensioners now officially living in severe poverty in the 5th largest economy in the world has reached 1 million. And we have a government condemned by the UN, for inflicting destitution on its own citizens. And you know, there's nothing balanced about the investment of this government across the country. Nothing balanced about a government investing over $4,000 per head in London on transport, and the north only $1,600. There's nothing balanced about a male child born in Kensington, Liverpool, who can expect to live 18 years less than a child born in Kensington and Chelsea. And on employment and wages. This is the government that has broken the historic link between securing a job and lifting yourself out of poverty. Shameful. The Chancellor has referred to a remarkable job story. What's remarkable is that this government has created a large-scale jobs market of low pay, long hours and precarious work. There's over 2.5 million people out there working below 15 hours a week. 3.8 million are in insecure work. Average wages, the Honourable Gentleman talks about pay, average wages are still below the level of 10 years ago. So it's hardly surprising, is it? It's hardly surprising that there are 4.5 million children living in poverty, 2/3 of them nearly, in households where someone is at work. And the Chancellor has bragged about his record on youth unemployment. Let's be clear. Youth unemployment is 7% higher than the national average. It's higher than the OECD average and is at an appalling level for some communities. Some communities. 26% of young black people are unemployed. 23% of young people from a Bangladeshi or Pakistani background are unemployed. And the Chancellor has claimed the advance with regard to women's unemployment. What does he say? What he doesn't say is that women make up 73% of those in part-time employment, and they're disproportionately affected by the precarious work. And I just give one example. The income of single mothers by 2020 will have fallen by 18% since 2010. And according to the much-respected Women's Budget Group, women are facing the highest pay gap for full-time employees since 1999, all on his watch. The Chancellor has been claiming on levels of infrastructure and housing investment that he's on the way to delivering record sustained levels. Let's be clear, he's talking about wish lists. He's not talking about what the Conservatives have actually done. The UK ranks close to the bottom of OECD countries for public investment. We're the 24th out of 32 countries, according to analysis done by the TUC. And the Chancellor describes the biggest rail investment programme since Victorian times. Well, tell that to the people who faced the timetabling chaos last year. Tell that to the rail passengers who have to deal with the incomparable incompetence of the Transport Secretary. The Chancellor has been hailing his announcement of a national infrastructure strategy. Well, let's remind the House. The government announced a national infrastructure delivery plan from 2016 to 2021. Then it announced a national infrastructure and construction pipeline. So there's plans, pipelines, strategies. And yet today, another review of the financing mechanisms, but no real action for delivery for our businesses and our communities. The Institute for Government described this government's decisions on infrastructure, and I quote, as inconsistent and subject to constant change. And he's announced on housing again. Well, let's hope the Chancellor has learnt the lessons of their recent housing initiatives. which have driven up profits of companies like Persimmon to over £1 billion and bosses' bonuses over £100 million. The Chancellor's got some cheek to speak out technical and vocational skills as well. Almost a quarter of all funding to further and adult education has been cut since 2010. The number of people starting apprenticeships has fallen by 26%. And you know, on research and development, this government has slashed capital funding for science across all departments by 50%. Unlike at the budget, the Chancellor has at last actually referred to climate change. The review of biodiversity, as I mentioned, might hopefully show that the budget of Natural England, the body responsible for biodiversity in England, has more than halved over a decade. A review of carbon offsets might reveal that they do not reduce emissions, and offsetting schemes like the Clean Development Mechanism have been beset by gaming and fraud. And this from a government that removed the climate change levy exemption for renewables, that scrapped the feed-in tariffs for new small-scale renewable generation, and cancelled the zero-carbon homes policy. Do you know, Gordon Brown pledged a zero-carbon homes policy standard. We endorsed it. We celebrated it. The Tories scrapped it in 2015, 1 year before it was fully coming into force. And of course, Brexit looms large on everything we discuss. But, you know, even today the Chancellor has tried to use the bribe of a double-deal dividend or threat of postponing the spending review to control MPs into voting for the government's deal. What we're seeing is not a double dividend. We're seeing Brexit bankruptcies as a result of the delay in the negotiations. And, you know, publication of the tariffs this morning is clearly part of this threatening strategy. This is a calamitous strategy. It is forcing people into intransigent corners rather than bringing them together. Yes. What we need now is the Chancellor today to stand with us, to vote to take no deal off the table, and to stand in Cabinet against those that are trying to force us into a no-deal situation. And then, yes, come and join us in discussing the options available, including Labour's deal proposal, and yes, if it requires taking back any deal to the public. For outside this Westminster bubble, maybe outside the narrow, wealthy circles in which the Chancellor moves, 9 years of hard austerity have created 9 years of hardship for our constituents. And today, and in recent times, the Chancellor has had the nerve to try and argue that to those who have suffered most at the hands of this government, that their suffering was necessary. If austerity wasn't ideological, why has money been found for tax cuts for big corporations while vital public services have been starved of funding? Austerity was never a necessity. It was always a political choice. So when the Chancellor stands there and talks about the end of austerity, talks about a plan for a brighter future, how can anyone who's lived through the last 9 years believe him at all? This is a government that's demonstrated a chilling ability to disregard completely the suffering that they've caused. To talk of changing direction after 9 years in office is not only impossible to believe, it's also much too late. Too late for the thousands who've died while waiting for a decision on their personal independence payments. Too late for the families who've lost their homes due to cuts in housing benefit. Too late, yes, for the young people who've lost their lives as a result of criminal attack. And too late also for those youngsters whose clubs have been and youth services have been savaged. This is the legacy of this Chancellor, and it's this that he'll be remembered for. He was the Shadow Chief Secretary to George Osborne and designed the austerity programme. History will hold him responsible for that. There are no alibis. He's implicated in every cut, every closure, every preventable death of someone waiting for hospital treatment or social care. It's time for a change. People have had enough. People have had enough. But people know also increasingly that they won't get the change they so desperately need from this tainted Chancellor or his government. It's time for change, and it's time for a Labour government.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the same old recycled lines. I think actually I must be going a little bit deaf, Mr. Speaker, because I didn't hear any mention of record employment. Perhaps he's so ashamed of Labour's record. No Labour government has ever left office with unemployment below that which it's inherited. I didn't hear anything about rising wages, rising the fastest they've been in a decade. He didn't mention the extra £1.3 billion for local government, the extra £1 billion of police funding, both of which he voted against. He didn't mention 9 years unbroken growth. He didn't mention the fact that this economy is outperforming Germany this year. He witters on about manufacturing without any recognition of the global economic context in which this sits. Perhaps he doesn't inhabit the global economy, but if he did, he'd know very well that the downturn in manufacturing is happening across Europe and is affecting everyone. And he didn't mention, Mr. Speaker, the remarkable turnaround in our public finances and the real choices that we have as a consequence. Just relentlessly talking Britain and its economy down. Once again we hear this absurd proposition that the decisions we took in 2010 were some kind of political choice, as if you could go on borrowing £1 for every pound spent indefinitely, racking up interest bills, burdening future generations with debt. No responsible politician could credibly believe that these were choices in 2010. He talks about homelessness. We've committed £1.2 billion to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. I didn't hear any mention of that. He talks about the downgrade of the 2019 economic forecast without mentioning the global context. He confuses the debt and the deficit. The reason that the debt has... He's not listening, but it's very, very simple. It's not even economics. It's not even economics, it's just maths. It's very, very simple. If you have a £150 billion deficit in your last year in office, your successor will find debt is rising. And that is what we found. And I have announced since 2016 £150 billion of additional public spending, as well as getting the forecast deficit down to 0.5% of GDP. That means, Mr. Speaker, that we have real and genuine sustainable choices in this country for the first time in a decade. Mr. Speaker, he delivers repeated misinformation that we've heard countless times from the Labour benches. For example, about transport funding. He knows that central government transport funding is higher per capita in the north than it is in London and the south. That's a fact. He knows that there are 665,000 fewer children in workless households now than there were in 2010. That's a fact. He knows that public investment set out in the OBR report today represents Britain's biggest public capital investment programme for 40 years. It's a fact. And he accuses me of talking about housing again. Well, I will talk about housing again and again and again, because we've announced £44 billion worth of investment in housing, and that's an awful lot of announcements that I am going to have to make. But, Mr. Speaker, the ultimate audacity is the moral lecturing tone in the close of his remarks. And I really do take exception to being lectured to by a man who has stood idly by, turning a blind eye, while his leader has allowed anti-Semitism to all but destroy to all but destroy a once great political party from the inside out. Mr. Speaker, Attlee and Bevan must be rotating in their graves. Look at what this pair have done to the Labour Party and just think what they would do to our country.
Yes, it might it might be helpful to the House if I indicate that, given the pressure of time and the importance to which reference was made earlier of subsequent business, it will almost certainly not be possible on this occasion for me to take everybody on this statement, which ordinarily, as the House knows, it's my practice to do. I'm looking to move on at approximately 2:45. It may be possible to move on before then, but I certainly wouldn't want it to be significantly later than then. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, may I sincerely congratulate my right honourable friend the Chancellor on keeping his head whilst all around are losing theirs. I'm sure he would have liked to have delivered a rather different statement if the vote had gone the other way last night. But does he agree with me that economic forecasting is difficult at all times, particularly a time of slowing global growth, trade war, Chinese debt problems, and above all, the uncertainty of Brexit? And does he agree with me that the optimistic forecasts by the OBR are based on a smooth progression to Brexit, with no new barriers put in place to trade and investment with our most important market on the basis that we currently enjoy under the customs union and the single market? So will he finally guarantee to me that he will keep his fiscal powder dry, keep his reserves as he may need them to avoid even recession or a financial crisis, and that he will resist the irresponsible approach of the opposition, who only have the idea of spending and borrowing money as a policy platform on every issue, and resist all the other understandable demands he's going to reach from all sides just to spend money in response to lobbies, because he has the duty of keeping the British economy intact at a time of almost unprecedented crisis and unforeseeable problems.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to my right honourable and learned friend that the OBR's central forecast is based, as before, on an assumption of a deal done with the European Union so that we exit via a transition mechanism and have a future close trading relationship with him. And I can assure him, as I'm sure he actually needs no reassurance, that I will not be remotely tempted by the policies or profligacy of the Shadow Chancellor. And he is absolutely right that until such time as we are sure that we will not exit via a disorderly no deal, I have to keep that fiscal powder dry. But no one will be happier than me when I am able to release some of that headroom to support public services, capital investment and lower taxes in this economy.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, there is no certainty about the future health of the economy, whatever happens regarding the Prime Minister's deal. Whether this House eventually accepts or continues to resoundingly reject it, we are still not clear about what the UK's future trading relationship with the EU will look like. What is clear, however, is that Brexit is bad for the economy. So far, the picture is bleak. Key economic indicators show the UK economy grew by a meagre 0.2% in the fourth quarter of 2018. The OBR had previously forecast growth of 1.6% for 2019, and even with the assumption of a smooth Brexit, they have downgraded that to 1.2%. Whatever the Chancellor's spin, is this not the cost of Brexit? But of course the Chancellor predicted this himself, telling Radio 4 that the economy will be slightly smaller in the Prime Minister's preferred version of the future partnership. And we now face the prospect of a no-deal Brexit, which would have a severe impact on the economy, push people and businesses across Scotland. It could push the Scottish economy into a deep recession, similar in scale to the financial crash of 2008. And the British Retail Consortium estimate that it could hike food prices by some 29%. Mr Speaker, my constituents cannot afford that. Will the Chancellor commit to voting against no deal tonight? Given such massive uncertainty, we needed a bit more than this damp squib of a statement. It is a laudable aim to have only one budget a year, but in these circumstances the Chancellor should have brought forward an emergency budget, and I call on him to do so. We need the Chancellor to explain how he is going to fix the fiscal gap created by discouraging immigration. We know that the average EU citizen who chooses to live and work in our country contributes £34,400 annually to the Scottish economy. How is he going to plug that gap? Will he exempt those coming for PhD level roles from the salary cap as well as from the visa numbers cap? We need the Chancellor to provide funding to small businesses who are not prepared to cope with Brexit. Only 8% of Scottish firms feel fully ready. We need concrete action to tackle the lack of productivity growth. It was woeful anyway compared to our European neighbours, but over the past 2 years business has been so focused on Brexit's damage limitation that they've lacked the resources to increase growth and to increase productivity. This week, Mr Speaker, the new financial think tank said our Conservative estimate shows that banks and investment banks are moving around £800 billion in assets. Asset managers have so far transferred more than £65 billion in funds, and insurance companies have so far moved £35 billion in assets. This appears to have entirely passed the Chancellor by. Mr Speaker, people who live in these islands have suffered through a decade of austerity. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the current benefits freeze has made life harder for over 27 million people across the UK. This is the biggest policy behind rising poverty, costing families an average of £340 a year. If the freeze continues, Mr Speaker, by 2020 it will have driven 400,000 people into poverty. This must end now. And under this government, while the poor get poorer, the rich get richer, FTSE 100 CEO pay has gone up by 66% under the Tories in government, while wages for the rest have failed to reach 2008 levels yet. The Chancellor has had many opportunities to press his colleagues to halt the rollout of universal credit. The system is broken and it must be fixed before more misery is inflicted. His emergency budget should end the benefits freeze and halt the rollout of universal credit. The Chancellor, Mr Speaker, has managed to find money for plenty of other things. He's allocated billions to the DUP in order to buy their support. He's failed to allocate £3.4 billion to Scotland that should have been our share of this largesse. Will the Chancellor ensure that the Barnett formula is properly applied to the new funding he has announced today, unlike his actions regarding the DUP deal? Scotland's resource block grant, Mr Speaker, for 2019-20 is almost £2 billion lower in real terms compared with 2010-11. This is a direct consequence of the Chancellor's continued obsession with austerity. He has created the Stronger Towns Fund, pumping money into leave voting areas as yet another bribe. How well did that work this week? And the Chancellor hasn't yet announced details of the Shared Prosperity Fund. Especially important is whether it will replace the £2.4 billion a year that communities across the UK currently receive as a result of EU structural funds. Can he provide us with full details now? And will he give a cast-iron guarantee that the Scottish Government will be treated as equals and will continue to distribute the funding in Scotland, as has been the case under the EU programmes? Mr Speaker, yesterday a majority of Scottish MPs put their names to an amendment saying that the best future for Scotland would be as an independent country within the EU. With independence, we will be able to encourage immigration, recognising the benefits brought by those who come to live, love and work in our country. We will be able to reject austerity, supporting our citizens when they need it most. We will be able to increase productivity, improving participation in our workforce and encouraging and supporting companies to grow. We will be able to trade frictionlessly with Europe, a market 8 times the size of the UK. Scotland has been badly served by consecutive Westminster governments. We need to take our lifeboat and get off this sinking Brexit ship.
I'm sure it was a momentary oversight by the Honourable Lady that she didn't say anything about the decommissioning measures that will be so important to her local industry in Aberdeen, which are listed in the WMS. Mr Speaker, she says that no deal will be bad for the economy, and I absolutely agree with her. But if she understands that, why didn't she vote for the deal? She talks... And then, I have a great deal of respect for the honourable lady, but I'm afraid she's creeping towards the practices of the Labour front bench when she quotes the fourth quarter growth figure at 0.2% without mentioning the more recently published first quarter of this year growth figure at 0.5%.
It's 2.5 times. Exactly.
Do the maths. I think she'll find that's okay. Mr. Speaker, the downgrade on she talked about the downgrade that the OBR has applied to the 2019 growth figure. Of course, we would like it to be higher, but she again has to see this in the global context. I know that she understands this. Germany's economy has slowed down. France's economy has slowed down. Across the G7, we are exactly in the middle of the pack. We will grow faster than Germany, Japan and Italy this year. We will grow exactly the same as France and slower than Canada and the US. That is a perfectly creditable performance. Would I like to do better? Of course I would. But she's going to be honest with the House. She needs to put this in the context of what's happening across the global economy. She asked me about PhD level roles. PhD level roles will be completely exempt from the visa cap. She asked me about assets being moved abroad. Of course I'm concerned about assets being moved abroad, and of course £35 billion of insurance company assets moved abroad is £35 billion more than I would like. But she needs to understand this in the context of the many trillions of pounds of assets that these companies are managing in London and increasingly, I have to say, in Edinburgh, where Edinburgh's ranking in the global asset management league table has once again risen, something we're extremely pleased about. She talks about pay for the lowest paid. Those on national minimum wage, national living wage, have seen their incomes increase on average by £2,750 a year since 2016. And she asked me about universal credit. Universal credit delivers. People who are on universal credit are more likely to be in work than people who are trapped on legacy benefits, and I have put billions of pounds into the system over successive fiscal events to smooth the transition, to ensure that the movement of people from legacy benefits onto universal credits operates smoothly. And I'd say to her finally that Scotland gets its share of the increased spending on both capital and resource, but precious little thanks we ever hear from those benches in exchange for it.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Building on the question asked by my right honourable learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe, the OBR have made it clear today that they have not really been able to update their forecast to reflect the current Brexit situation. They say that we still have no meaningful basis for predicting the post-Brexit trading relationship beyond the near term. I sense the Chancellor's frustration with the House's inability to approve the withdrawal agreement, but does he agree that this means that actually many of the forecasts obviously are going to have to be revisited as the Brexit scenario plays itself out over the next few months? The Chancellor mentioned, sorry, I haven't finished yet. The Chancellor mentioned the CSR, forthcoming CSR. He mentioned education spending. Can I also urge him to think very clearly and closely about the spending on further education colleges? That is another critical part of improving productivity in our country. But the question I really wanted to ask is that the budget report produced by the Treasury Select Committee recently said that the Chancellor was effectively disregarding the fiscal objective to run a balanced budget in the mid-2020s, and the OBR has today said that the target will not be met again. So does the Chancellor intend by the next budget to ensure that the existing fiscal charter will be updated for this Parliament?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady is right, of course, about the OBR's Brexit assumption. I said so earlier, and the OBR have said so clearly. They have to make an assumption, and until there's a new policy, that's unfortunately the way they're mandated to work. On the question of the forecast, look, I've addressed this in this House many times before. The forecast is based on those assumptions. We're either going to have a no-deal exit, in which case I would expect a significantly worse outturn, or we're going to lift this cloud from above our economy, and I would actually expect a significantly better outcome. And a number of important commentators, including the Governor of the Bank of England, have suggested over the last couple of weeks that there is more juice in the economy if we can just lift this cloud. I've noted her early bid for further education in the spending review. There will be lots to discuss as we go into the spending review, and we will ensure, Mr. Speaker, that there are proper structured arrangements for members of this House to make their views known. My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, will be happy to engage across the House. And she asked me finally about the target for the mid-2020s. I simply don't accept that the figures published today show that it is impossible to reach a balanced budget in the mid-2020s. In 2023-24, the deficit will be 0.5% of GDP. But whether we choose to get the deficit down to zero or whether we choose to do other things is a choice, and we're lucky to have it.
The honourable lady, the member for Manchester Central, is ordinarily known for her buoyant and enthusiastic smile, was gesticulating at the Chancellor to speed up. I think she was auditioning for the role of Speaker, and presumably seeking to give the right honourable gentleman a masterclass in brevity, notwithstanding her desire often to make her own point with enormous eloquence, but at not inconsiderable length. But we'll see. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the forecast from the OBR today, GDP growth this year is being revised down by 0.4%. The largest downward revision is to business investment, a downward revision of 3.2%. Business investment is now expected to shrink 1% this year, after shrinking by 1% last year. The Federation of Small Businesses today say that confidence is at rock bottom. The CBI say on tariffs that there has been no consultation with business, no time to prepare, and that this is a sledgehammer for our economy. Does the Chancellor recognise that businesses are losing patience with this government, and that unless businesses invest and help grow our economy, productivity and wages are going to stay at rock bottom? What is the Chancellor going to do to reverse this incredibly worrying and dangerous reduction in business investment?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what she hasn't mentioned is that business investment recovers to 2.3% in next year, and over the forecast recovers entirely. So this is a cyclical change, not a structural change. And there are two drivers. Of course, Brexit uncertainty is having a damping effect on investment. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. The sooner we can lift it, the sooner that investment will come into our economy with welcome effect. But we cannot ignore what is happening in the car industry across Europe. A large part of this effect has been in our car industry, which is very worrying, but it isn't a UK phenomenon, it's a much broader phenomenon.
Sir John Redwood.
Given the fall in new car sales that followed the big increase in vehicle excise duties, other regulatory changes and the car loan squeeze, will the Chancellor now review policy towards the car industry to make it cheaper and easier to buy a new car made in a British factory?
Well, as my right honourable friend knows, we are not able to discriminate between cars made in British factories and cars made elsewhere under the current regime, but we do keep all fiscal policy under review, and I'm acutely conscious of the pressures that the car industry is facing at the moment.
Sir Vincent Gable.
Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to find something positive to say in a rather less than earth-shattering event, but I do welcome the support for industrial strategy and innovation and the Thurnham report. But on that specifically, doesn't it rather give the game away that he's referring references to global monopoly abuse to the British competition authorities at a time when we're walking away from the much more powerful European Commission, which could really deal with the problem? But specifically on growth, is it not the case that while we are escaping recession, and that's very welcome, this is primarily due to continued extraordinary monetary policy, low negative real interest rates,
That cannot continue. It's an addictive drug. It may have been useful after the financial crisis. And finally, how on earth does he expect this surge of business investment to occur when even on the government's Brexit plans there's going to be a cliff edge in 2 years' time, which any businesses will naturally seek to avoid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know why the honourable gentleman would want to break the habit of a lifetime in finding something positive to say in response to a statement, but I'll take him at face value. Look, on the Furman report, I think it's quite important that we do ensure that the UK's regulatory environment is at the cutting edge of the changes that are going on in the 21st century economy. I think that regulation is one of our competitive advantages. We have excellent regulators, and we've got plenty of examples of the UK being ahead of the global curve in setting regulations that can both protect the public and encourage investment. And I can't comment on monetary policy, as he knows. That's a matter entirely for the Bank of England. But as for a future cliff edge, it will be my fervent intention to give business the maximum confidence and clarity we can about our future relationship with the European Union as early as I can.
Sir Michael Fallon.
Would the Chancellor reassure me that the very welcome consultation on future infrastructure financing will not become any reason to delay a start on some of the essential major projects, such as the Lower Thames crossing, which will not only relieve pressure on the Dartford crossing, but will be a fundamental link between two great wealth-creating regions of our country?
I can give my right honourable friend that assurance. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that we're committed to building a tunnel under the Thames, but we haven't yet committed to the link roads that will link that tunnel to the rest of the road network, and of course we absolutely will do so. This is a broader based review to look at how we replace PFI and EIB funding over the medium term.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, I welcome the statement and the news that despite the best efforts and concerted efforts of those who think that by talking the UK economy down they can somehow stop us leaving the EU, and it's pleasing to note that employment is up, job creation's up, the government finances are in a better shape, and I think it does show that we don't need the EU as some kind of economic crutch in order to enable us to stand on our own 2 feet. I also welcome the Barnett consequences for Northern Ireland. Could I ask the Chancellor, for the future, what progress has been made on the review of our passenger duty and VAT for the hospitality industry in Northern Ireland? And if he is going to help subcontractors against late payments, would he be considering the use of project bank accounts, which have been very successful in Northern Ireland in ensuring that public sector spend on infrastructure projects actually reaches the companies who do spend the money?
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the honourable gentleman's comments, and I just draw the House's attention to the fact that one of the features of the jobs growth that we have delivered is the regional distribution of it. This is not a London-centric jobs growth. It's across the country. Productivity, wages and employment have grown in every region of the UK, and that's very welcome. On the specific questions he asks, on the APD, the working group has been established, as he knows, but we are not in a position to take any action in this area until there is a devolved administration in Stormont. On VAT, as again he knows, we are not able to take any action while we are members of or subject to the rules of the European Union, but we will continue to look at these issues.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And you should see the honourable lady from Manchester, what she's like in my Education Select Committee. I strongly welcome the statement from my right honourable friend. Could I just ask him, given that there is a 10-year plan for the NHS, and rightly so, can we please have a 10-year plan and a 10-year funding settlement for our schools and colleges in the statement that he's going to make before the summer?
Mr. Speaker, let me make it just clear for the avoidance of doubt. The NHS 10-year plan has now been published, but the funding plan that we've announced is a 5-year plan, and there will be a midpoint at which we fund the NHS for the latter part of the plan. So we have no plans, I'm afraid, to set out a 10-year funding plan for any area of our public services. That would not be prudent or sensible given the cyclicality of the economy.
The honourable member for Manchester Central is much talked about. I think it's time we heard from her. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm reclaiming the bossy, reclaiming it. Isn't it the case, Chancellor, that cuts to police, local services and schools is a false economy? Yeah. We pay for the cost of failure, the cost of rising knife crime, the cost of school exclusions, the cost of rising poverty and failing families and children. So will he prioritise in his forthcoming spending review early intervention to support families and children to get the best start in life?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there will be many demands on the available funding at the spending review, and we intend to look at the public's priorities in the round. And our challenge, as always, is to ensure that we direct funding in the way that most effectively delivers the end result that the public needs. And as if I just look at the knife crime debate that we've been having over the last couple of weeks, it is clear that this isn't a simple question about putting more money into policing. It's a question. No, it isn't. It isn't. And if the honourable lady talks to police chiefs, if she talks to school heads, they will tell her this is a multifaceted challenge, and we need to address it as such. And that's the point of having a cross-departmental spending review, that we can look at our priorities in the round and decide how to allocate funding in a coherent way to get the outcomes the public wants at the best value for money for the taxpayer.
And Speaker, I warmly welcome the big improvements in the public finances, particularly those as a result of the last spending review in 2015. But he does have a problem with stamp duty. Today's document says the forecast here has, quote, deteriorated significantly since October, when it was already £4 billion short. Receipts fell 9.8% in 2018, another £2.7 billion new shortfall in the scorecard today. Transactions in my constituency are down 31% since the reforms. This is something he is going to need to look at and propose reforms in due course, perhaps in November. Would he like to comment on the latest deteriorating numbers?
Mr. Speaker, and my honourable friend, perhaps unsurprisingly given his constituency, is very interested in these issues, and I'd be very happy to meet with him and go through the numbers. There are a number of moving parts underneath the headline number. Stamp duty for Wales has been devolved, so that takes a significant chunk out of the total number. There is an overall slowdown in the market, and that has an effect. But we've also exempted first-time buyer purchases from stamp duty, and that's a very considerable chunk of the reduction he refers to. But I'd be very happy to talk him through the details.
Chris Leslie.
It's a fundamental mistake for the Chancellor to underestimate the impact of Brexit on his future forecasts, to dismiss that 3.2% collapse in the forecast for business investment, I think is a strategic error that he is making for the future. And to hear the Chancellor talk about a deal dividend, or the Shadow Chancellor to talk about a jobs-first Brexit, this is a mythology. Brexit, of all forms, is going to hit our business investment and hit our tax revenues and create austerity for a decade ahead. So please, can the Chancellor and the Shadow Chancellor stop treating this as business as usual?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman, while he's entitled to his point of view and he often makes a valuable contribution to the debate, has to be careful that he doesn't accidentally veer off-piste into the talking Britain down syndrome. He talks about a collapse in business investment, but I think he would agree, I hope he would agree, that this is likely to be a cyclical reduction in business investment. If you talk to businesses, what they'll tell you is that they are postponing investment decisions until they have greater clarity about the future. Now, I do agree with him. We can't keep them hanging there forever. We need to give them clarity and certainty as quickly as possible. I believe we will do that in this House over the next few weeks. And when we do, I believe that the great majority of that investment, postponed, not cancelled, will flow back into our economy later this year.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say I'm delighted that the Chancellor has made the announcement about the Borderlands growth deal. This is very welcome news for the area. But would the Chancellor confirm that the Department will move to an early discussion about the details of the various projects with the local authorities so that it can get on with the implementation as soon as possible? And can I also ask the Chancellor, would you like to come and visit Carlisle and the Borderlands to see those initiatives in action?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I can confirm that we want to move ahead as quickly as possible now with agreeing the individual projects and getting disbursement underway. And I'd be actually delighted to visit Carlisle, not only to see the effects of the Borderlands growth deal, but to see the £100 million HIF investment that we're making to facilitate a major expansion of new build housing in the area.
Angela Eagle.
Many on both sides of the House have expressed some worry about the slowdown in growth forecasts, but all of us see that there is some growth there. So given that the economy is growing, albeit too modestly, would the Chancellor look at the £1.4 billion of cuts that are going to be made to benefits with the benefit freeze in 3 weeks' time, which means that he's taking money away from those who are least able to afford it? And all economic theory shows that those who are on very, very low or modest incomes actually spend money that's given to them, which will then help stimulate our economy some more. So will he now get up at that dispatch box and tell us that he's going to take off the benefit freeze, which is due to hit all those people in 3 weeks' time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady talks about slow reductions in economic forecasts. It's actually 1 year. I'll answer the question in my own way, if the honourable lady doesn't mind. It's only 1 year in which the OBR has downgraded the forecast. In 2 further years, they remain unchanged, and in the fourth year, it is increased. She asked me about the benefits freeze. Look, this has been one of the very many difficult decisions we've had to take. Under the last Labour government, under Gordon Brown's stewardship, benefits, the welfare budget increased by 65% in real terms, getting it completely out of kilter with wages and making it unsustainable. That, combined with the fiscal pressure we faced in 2010, made it inevitable that we had to take action. But we've made it very clear we have no intention of repeating the current freeze. When it is over, increases in benefits will resume in line with CPI in the normal way.
George Freeman.
I welcome the Chancellor's announcements, particularly on investments in science and infrastructure, and seeing as the Workers' Party haven't welcomed it, the rise in the national living wage, the £700 pay rise for the lowest paid, and the tax reductions, 32 million of our lowest paid receiving a tax cut. You'd think the party opposite would cheer that. Could I also welcome the fact that the Chancellor has reminded British business that if Brexit is a threat, the Shadow Chancellor, who's still a Marxist, is an even bigger threat? And could I ask on growth that 1.2% is too low a figure? And could I urge him to use the comprehensive spending review to make sure that, as well as increasing spending on services, we incentivise really bold public sector leadership for innovation, for enterprise, and to make sure we get this economy growing at 3% again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, nobody shares his ambition to see faster growth more than I do, and there are many ways we can deliver that, but it has to involve raising productivity in both the public and the private sector. And we're taking initiatives with the National Leadership Centre around public sector leadership to enhance productivity in the public sector, and we're taking action to reinforce leadership among smaller and medium-sized enterprises in the private sector to ensure that productivity is driven, technology is taken up effectively, and we're all better off as a consequence.
Alison McGovern.
Mr. Speaker, I have more respect than many in this House for the work of economic forecasters. But let's be honest, what we have here today is a big, long sum that's predicated on the idea that Brexit will be fine. But surely the events of the past 24 hours demonstrate to us, Mr. Speaker, that Brexit is not going very well, is it? No. But nor are things in the country, because last year the Trussell Trust gave out nearly 1.5 million three-day food parcels. A massive increase on last year. So when, Mr. Speaker, will the Chancellor admit that Brexit is a massive distraction for our country, and it's about time we got back to tackling what the public really care about: rough sleeping, poverty, and the position of the worst off in our society?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have never been afraid to acknowledge that as far as the economy is concerned, Brexit uncertainty is a distraction, and it is something that we need to get lifted as soon as possible. I think I said that at the beginning of my speech. The sooner we can do that, the better. It will help us to grow faster, it will help us to raise productivity more quickly, and that means higher wages across the economy. But on the issues that the Honourable Lady mentions, we're putting £1.2 billion into addressing homelessness and rough sleeping. We're consulting on an additional 1% stamp duty levy on properties bought by non-UK resident owners. The whole of that money ring-fenced to address the rough sleeping challenge in our cities. And in relation to poverty, she knows the figures. We've got over 3.5 million more people in work, and 665,000 fewer children living in workless households. And it remains the case, however much people opposite may not like it, it remains the case that work is the best sustainable route out of poverty.
Alex Chalk.
Can I congratulate the Chancellor on his statement? If we do get the orderly Brexit that I know he and I want, can I urge him to consider schools funding in the spending review? Schools in my constituency are doing enormously important work, but they are facing increased challenges, particularly with pupil volatility, with pupil complexity, rising demands. They're having to do more, and I would invite him to ensure that they have the resources to match.
Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, we put £1.3 billion into the schools budget in 2017, and we've protected per pupil real funding since then. And he will also know that there is a significant variation between the level of funding between schools and authorities across the country, which is now being addressed through the fair funding formula. And I understand that there are pressures in the system until we've got that rolled out and operational, having delivered the result throughout the system. But I can confirm to him that schools funding will be considered, along with all other areas of departmental spending, in the round in the spending review.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To follow up on that question, I'm sure that the Chancellor may have noticed that there are children all over the country, including in the Prime Minister's constituency, and amongst these children, my children sit, who will no longer be able to go to school all day on a Friday anymore, because my son's school is going to shut at 1 o'clock, like 15 other schools in Birmingham, and hundreds of schools across the country who've been getting in touch with me, including the Prime Minister's constituency. I'm sure they'll be writing to her, because they're certainly writing to me. What has he offered today for the government to do the most basic thing and keep my children in school? What has been given today, what will be given in the CSR, and I hope he's looking forward to seeing my children, because I'm bringing them to be looked after by him every Friday at 1 o'clock.
I shall look forward to it, Mr. Speaker. Look, today is not a fiscal event, and the opportunity to look at spending priorities in the round will happen at the spending review. What I have described today, though, is a world where improving public finances mean that if we can lift the Brexit cloud from our economy, get that certainty restored, we will have choices. And that is something, frankly, that we have not enjoyed in this country for a decade now because of the consequences of the crisis under the last Labour government. But if she wants to talk to me about schools, I'm happy to talk about our record on schools, with the attainment gap narrowing, record rates of disadvantaged 18-year-olds going to university, 84% of children being taught in good or outstanding schools, compared to 66% in 2010. Outcomes that we are proud of.
Neil O'Brien.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if I could take the Chancellor's view on the question of poverty. Under the last Labour government, we saw 1 million men and women thrown on the dole. Under this government, unemployment's down to the lowest rate it's been for 40 years. And yet we hear this argument from the other side that work is not the way out of poverty, only spending ever more on benefits is the answer. But in reality, am I correct, Chancellor, in noting that when a workless couple move from being out of work to in full-time work, their chances of being in poverty drop from 38% to a negligible less than 1%. So work is the way out of poverty. And what assessment has the Chancellor made of the combined effects of cutting taxes for the lowest paid, reducing unemployment to the lowest level for 40 years, the new national living wage, and what assessment has he made of his intentions to go further today in boosting that proud achievement of the national living wage in reducing poverty further?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've seen the proportion of people in low pay falling to its lowest level in 20 years. I've already mentioned the statistics on the number of people in work, and I agree with him that being in work is the only sustainable way out of poverty. And he's right. The last Labour government left 1.4 million people languishing on out-of-work benefits. And anyone who thinks that that is a good outcome needs to be ashamed of themselves. Absolutely true. So I can assure my honourable friends that this issue is high on our agenda and that we are looking at ways of maintaining the record that we have built up, which is exactly the one that I want to deliver. Thank you.
David Hanson.
Could the Chancellor confirm that many millions more pounds have been cut from the police budget than the £100 million he's put in for overtime to support our hard-pressed police officers already? And could he particularly confirm to me, in his statement he says the £100 million is for England. When I was a Home Office police minister, Home Office funding was for England and Wales. Have Wales been left out again?
I believe, I mean, this is I will triple, no, I'm aware of what he's saying. I'm aware of what he's saying. My understanding is that the funding figure is for England. It's England, I'm sorry, my honourable friend's telling me it's England and Wales. So I apologise to the honourable gentleman if the statement misled. I'm told that it is England, the funding is for England and Wales.
That's another matter. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the continued improvement in public finances, which in no small part is due to the continued resilience and innovation of our businesses, some of whom the Chancellor met when he came recently to open the new business school at the University of Gloucester. And what a symbol that is of change, because only 9 years ago in Gloucester we lost 6,000 jobs in business thanks to the disastrous policies of the party opposite, and youth unemployment was 4 times higher than it is now today. But my right honourable friend knows the extraordinary enthusiasm on all sides of this House to see continued funding going into the schools, and also from my letter with 165 colleagues across 4 different parties for improved funding for further education colleges. Could he therefore share with us today that these are priorities that he will look at very closely in the spending review?
I very much enjoyed my visit to the University of Gloucester and was very interested to see the innovative work that's going on there. My honourable friend refers to the improvement in the public finances. It's being driven by increased business tax receipts, partly as a result of the government's relentless clampdown on opportunities for avoidance or evasion of taxes, and the very significant increase in employment. 3.5 million more people in work is not just very good news for 3.5 million households, but it's very good news for the Exchequer, the public finances, and ultimately our public services as well.
Opposition.
Karen Buck.
Isn't it in fact true that poverty in this country increasingly wears a working face? That we have the highest proportion we have ever had of families in poverty who are in work? That a family of 4 with 2 people working full-time on the national minimum wage will be £600 a year worse off thanks to his benefit freeze by 2020? And in fact, because he will not tackle the benefit freeze, including on in-work benefits, that families in this condition will see absolutely nothing as a consequence of today's statement.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already made the point about the unsustainable rise in welfare payments under the last Labour government. 65% real terms increase in the welfare budget was not a sustainable position. The Honourable Lady can chunt her as much as she likes from the front bench. It won't make it sustainable. It won't make it sustainable. But I tell the Honourable Lady what will help her constituents: the £6,500 per family tax cuts for people earning low wages, buying fuel, voted against by her government, her opposition front bench, and the £2,500 increase in the national living wage since 2016 of someone working on full-time on low wages.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was delighted to hear the Chancellor plough £260 million into the Borderlands growth deal, which shows this government's commitment to cross-border infrastructure investment. This will allow the Borders Railway to move forward in terms of its extension from Tweedbank to Hoyk, Newcastleton and on to Carlisle. Now, I was very pleased to hear him respond to my honourable friend, the member for Carlisle's request to visit Carlisle, but would, when he's visiting Carlisle, also come across the border and visit my constituency in the Scottish Borders, which will see significant benefits from this investment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the whole point about the Borderlands growth deal is to celebrate the economic geography of the border region on both sides of that non-line between Scotland and England. And so I think he's made a very good point. If I'm coming to Carlisle, I think I need to cross the border and visit his constituency on the other side, and I shall certainly do so.
Chukwuemeka.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Growth is now forecast to be 1.2% and 1.4% in 2019 and 2020, and it's worth reflecting on the fact that before the EU referendum, it was forecast to be 2.1% in each of those years. Now, growth over the forecast period of under 2% is sluggish, it's unimpressive, and will be exacerbated if we fall off a cliff and leave without a deal. Can the Chancellor tell this House, because I think we need the benefit of knowing before we vote, whether he will be voting against us leaving without a deal this evening when we have a vote on the motion?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will be voting against us leaving without a deal. I have always believed that leaving without a deal would be bad for the UK economy. That continues to be my view. But can I just take him up on the point that he's made about the relatively higher growth forecasts that we saw until a year or so ago? What we need to remember is that this is a structural downgrade. The OBR revised their estimate of the growth rate of productivity in the economy, and until we get that productivity growth rate back, we will not see sustainable higher growth in this economy. That is why it is the #1 priority and drives every announcement I make.
Tim Lawton.
Further to the point from the Honourable Lady from Manchester Central, I'm pleased to see the Chancellor is recognising the urgency of school funding in the spending review, but can he not ignore children's social care? Because spending on early intervention by local authorities has fallen from £3.7 billion to £1.9 billion, but at the same time spending on late intervention by local authorities has risen from 5.9 to 6.7 billion. It doesn't take rocket science to work out the link, so will he make sure that he acknowledges that not investing early is a false economy, both socially and financially?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm all in favour of early intervention approaches where they can be shown to be effective. He will know that at the budget I announced an extra £410 million next year for social care, including for children. And we also announced £84 million specifically over 5 years to pilot schemes to try and keep more children safely at home. But his representation is noted and he will have an opportunity to make more formal representations ahead of the spending review to my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary.
And we need to speed up because I want to accommodate colleagues. A sentence question? Anne Clwyd.
Mr. Speaker, I too want clarity from the Chancellor. When he talks about England, as he did about environmental spending, did he mean just England or did he also mean England and Wales? Or is there going to be extra money given to Wales? I had one of the worst industrial polluters in the whole of the UK 35 years ago when I was elected. It's left us with derelict land, 27 acres at the bottom of a valley, a lot of wasted investment. Please will you help us get that cleaned up, get the toxic waste taken away and the land made suitable for people to use.
Well, the environmental reviews that I announced today did not involve the distribution of further money. And of course, under the devolution settlement, where issues are devolved, then money announced will be for England only. Where they are reserved, then of course they will be made available. It will be made available more widely.
Rebecca Powell.
A big toss-up, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. I would very much like to welcome the focus on the environment and climate change in today's announcement. Thank you, Chancellor, for listening to so many representations, not just from the people of Taunton Deane, but everywhere, for the marine conservation belt, but particularly for linking biodiversity and its decline with the economy. And please could he give some indication about when we might hear about the results of this new review, which could do for biodiversity what the Stern report did for climate change?
Well, my honourable friend is right. The review could have very far-reaching consequences, but we haven't started it yet, and we're only just scoping the terms of reference with the reviewer, so I'm afraid I can't give her a definitive answer as to how long it will take, but I'll let her know as soon as I can.
Louise Haigh.
Whilst any extra money for the police is obviously welcome, officers will be looking on in horror to find that it's due only on overtime, as they're so overstretched already. And given that we know the Chancellor has said that they should be reprioritising, does he agree with his honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, that they should be deprioritising spending on historic child sexual exploitation?
Mr. Speaker, the money that we've announced today, exceptionally, because this is not a fiscal event, is targeted on overtime, because what police officers and police chiefs are telling us is that is the immediate tool at their disposal. There's £970 million of additional spending capacity going into police forces in 2019-20 from April, but many of police forces have already committed that to funding recruitment and training. That won't come online for some time. So overtime, mutual aid is the preferred immediate response that police officers are signalling to us. Please.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recognising that women and girls face different challenges in life from men and boys, can I thank the Chancellor for listening to MPs from across the House in making his announcement on free sanitary products today? And can I ask him to advise when he expects this initiative to start?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend, and I congratulate her for her part in this campaign, I can tell my honourable friend that we are ready to fund the distribution of free sanitary products from the start of the new school year in September. But I cannot commit my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, to a September start until the procurement process, which unfortunately has to be gone through because we have to comply with rules, has been properly scoped. But it will be as early as possible in the new school year.
Now, this is the challenge. Can people ask their question in fewer than 30 seconds? Caroline Lucas.
It seems that the Chancellor is hoping to buy off the rising tide of youth campaigning with a sprinkling of announcements on the environment. But the science is clear he's doing nothing like enough. We've got 11 years to avoid climate breakdown. Protected species are in freefall. So I've got one test for him.
this afternoon where he can prove if he's serious, remotely serious about this agenda. Will he reverse the savage funding cuts that his government have made to Natural England? Yes or no?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady is nothing if not cynical, I have to say. Any question, funding for anybody's will be considered in the spending review, and I'd be very happy to have a representation from her.
Catherine McKinnell.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor made a welcome but passing comment in respect of the Northern Powerhouse Rail. But can I ask him when he is going to bring forward the investment in the East Coast Main Line to make it fit for purpose and HS2 ready? Because without that investment north of York, the HS2 East Coast Main Line communities risk being further away rather than closer to the community, to the connections that are so required.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the way it works, as I think the honourable lady very well knows, is that we allocate funding, and we are allocating capital funding at the fastest rate into our railway than any time since the Victorians. We allocate the funding for the so-called control periods of investment in the railway, and the Transport Secretary then works with Network Rail to prioritise that investment. So I will pass on to him the honourable lady's concerns.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Chancellor for his announcement on the package of reforms to take on apprenticeships. I would ask him, as a plea as Chair of the Disability All-Party Group, to make sure he particularly supports those businesses who take on apprentices who have disabilities. It's extremely important that they achieve their full potential and have so many challenges and barriers to the workplace currently. Our own Speaker has championed apprenticeships, internships actually, for people with disabilities in this House. It's been working miraculously, but we need to roll this out right across the United Kingdom. So please, please ensure that people with disabilities get that equality of choice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do, of course, support people with disabilities going into work with financial support for employers where necessary. And we have an extremely good record in this country over many years on employment of disabled people, well ahead of many of our competitors. And we've got an extremely good record over the last 9 years of this government at increasing the number of disabled people in work. And it's a simple fact that as employment rises, as we've seen, the barriers for disabled people getting into work are lowered automatically, by virtue of the operation of the labour market.
Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By 2021, this government would have cut £1 billion from the Metropolitan Police budget, which is why I wrote him a letter signed by every single London Labour MP asking for more funding to tackle the rise in violent crime. Can the Chancellor today confirm how much additional funding has been allocated to the London Met?
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't. The £100 million that we've announced today will be for the police as a whole, and my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will engage with police chiefs. But can I suggest, if she's concerned, as she obviously is, about policing in London, she gets in touch with the Labour Mayor of London and asks him to get off his backside and do something about it.
Yes.
Tracy Bravin.
I saw you. Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully to the Chancellor's statements, and there was very little mentioned about freelancers and the self-employed. The Prime Minister in PMQs just this afternoon talked about the government wanting to increase female entrepreneurship, but excluding the self-employed from sharing parental leave is causing women's businesses to fail. Research by Parental Pay Equality showed only 20% of mums were back to their pre-baby earnings by the time their child was 2. Could I ask the Chancellor, please, to work across the House and with his colleagues to support my bill so that all parents can share parental leave and women can fulfil their full potential?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to look at the issue that the honourable lady has raised. We have been looking at access to employment rights and benefits by the self-employed, but as she knows, there is an issue here that the self-employed pay significantly lower contributions into the Exchequer than the employed. And the pressure is always to raise entitlements and access for the self-employed. But it's very clear, and I learned the hard way in 2017, that the self-employed do not want to see their contributions to the Exchequer raised, and that creates a tension.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had evidence to our Education Select Committee that children with special educational needs and disabilities are not getting support based on their needs, but instead based upon the rationed resources available. SEND funding is in crisis and parents are feeling desperately. Will the Chancellor take this opportunity to act immediately to make ring-fenced funding available to give all our children the support they need?
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't do that, but I can assure the honourable lady that special education needs funding will be considered as part of the spending review, and I'm sure that her committee will want to make representations on that. But look, we do have to make choices. There will be, I can confidently predict this, at the spending review, there will be far more bids for funding from across government and agencies and all departments than there is funding available. So we do have to look at what our priorities are as a nation.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has slashed billions of pounds from policing, 21,000 police officers taken out of the system. Violent crime's gone up, the knife crime epidemic is terrorising our communities, and the police are at breaking point. Can I ask the Chancellor, ahead of the next spending review, to prioritise investing in the police service so that we can genuinely tackle knife crime and violent crime in our country?
Well, I've just done it, Mr. Speaker, with £100 million today, and of course, as she knows, we put £460 million into police this year. There's £970 million going into the police next year, and £100 million extra announced today. And of course, the police will be considered very carefully in the spending review.
Can I very gently exhort caring and sharing comrades to care for and share with each other, not to speak in such a way as to stop others speaking. So I'm sure they wouldn't want to do that. That would be uncomradely. Neil Gray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I and my colleagues have encouraged him. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has encouraged him, and presumably the Work and Pension Secretary has encouraged him to scrap the final year of the benefit freeze. So why, when he knows that alongside the two-child policy it is one of the worst policies for driving up child poverty, has he maintained it? Why didn't he scrap it this spring statement?
Mr. Speaker, once again, the spring statement is not a fiscal event, so I'm not making fiscal announcements. And I've already explained why the benefit freeze was necessary, difficult but necessary, and that we have no intention of extending it. When it's finished, when it comes to an end, benefits will then resume their increase in line with CPI inflation.
Daniel Rowley.
I welcome the period provision announcement and thank the Chancellor for listening to campaigners. Will he extend that into primary schools, universities and homeless shelters? Will he commit to scrapping the tampon tax as soon as we come out of the EU? And will he recognise the girls he talks about missing days of school are also the same girls going to school hungry, and we will not end period poverty until we have ended poverty?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I suppose it's a manifestation of the universal truth that you can never satisfy. There's a good case has been made for providing free sanitary products in secondary schools and colleges where there's a controlled environment for their distribution and where the bulk of the need clearly is. Of course, I understand there is an issue around primary schools, and I'm quite open to sensible suggestions for how we might address that. But the core of the problem is in secondary schools and colleges, and we've addressed that today, and I hope the honourable lady would recognise that.
Mary Cray.
35% over the last 8 years. So while I welcome what he said on the Future Homes Standard, which is genuinely new and innovative, he cannot expect the people in Natural England and the Environment Agency to keep doing more with less whilst enduring a pay freeze, a 15% real terms pay cut over the last 10 years. Our Prime Minister has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. In July, she will be going to New York and basically saying what she's doing to end poverty, violence and hunger. With infant mortality rising, child hunger rising, what has he announced today to tackle that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, this is not a this is not a fiscal statement today. I take on board the various points that she's made, and my right honourable friend will, of course, be going to the conference in New York. But look, sometimes I don't recognise this country from the descriptions I hear from the benches opposite. I get out plenty, but I do not recognise this country. Of course we have problems. Of course we have challenges. But could we stop talking Britain down relentlessly all the time?
Who's up for a single sentence? Ben Lake.
Could the Chancellor clarify the extent to which reduced business investment and fewer tax reliefs have contributed to higher corporation tax receipts?
Indeed. John?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but clearly corporation tax receipts have gone up as a result of reducing corporation tax rates, making the UK one of the most attractive places for businesses to establish and to invest. Right now, as I've acknowledged, business investment is depressed by uncertainty about Brexit. The sooner we can end it, the sooner we can get back to business.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor will be aware that the budget for the Welsh Government has been reduced by some £4 billion since 2010 due to his austerity. Local councils and public services have a massive impact due to that. When the jobs and frontline services are all that's left to cut, so will the Chancellor end that austerity and apologise for the pain that he's caused public services?
Well, I've announced today, Mr. Speaker, a trajectory for the growth of public spending in the next spending review period, which will be at least 1.2% per annum real terms growth. That will have consequences, positive consequences for Welsh Government spending.
Karen Smith.
Of the money and control of further education, the apprenticeships level, T-levels and the adult education budget is a barrier to productivity in the Bristol and wider economic region. What support will he give to the Bristol and the wider economic West of England region to bring these things together so that we can improve our productivity situation?
Well, I'm interested in her suggestion that fragmentation is a barrier to productivity. That is genuinely interesting to me. And if she's working with her LEP to look at this, I'd be very happy to engage with them and talk about the challenge. We want to drive improved productivity throughout our public services, including our further education sector.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Chancellor ever heard of the WASPI campaign? And if he has, is he deliberately choosing to ignore WASPI women?
Mr. Speaker, I have heard of the campaign, and we've settled this issue a number of years ago, yes, we have, dealing with a very difficult set of challenges, but we've done what we had to do, and I know the campaign is continuing, but I have no further announcements to make.
Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government will know that since they walked away from local councils, frontline services like adult social care, children's safeguarding have been massively underfunded, adding more and more pressure to low-income families and council tax. When will they eventually give proper funding for children's services and adult social care?
Well, Mr. Speaker, at the risk of being repetitive, we will be having a spending review later this year, and the question of local government funding, how the business rates retention interacts with the other structures of funding, will all be looked at in that spending review. But in the meantime, we have increased funding for local government by £1.3 billion. We've increased funding for local government by £1.3 billion, meaning that local government has real terms increase in spending available to it this year, and the front bench opposite voted against it.
One sentence each. Alison Thewlis.
When will they end the state-sanctioned age discrimination and make sure that everybody, including those under 25, are entitled to a real living wage?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times before, the most important thing in the case of people under the age of 25 is to ensure that they get into the workforce and establish a pattern of work.
Sentence. Imran Hussain.
Almost half the children living in my constituency are living in poverty as a direct result of his ideological austerity agenda. Why isn't the stain of rising child poverty enough for him to act today?
There's nothing ideological about getting a deficit down from £150 billion a year to enable us to sustainably fund our public services in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Chancellor confirm that the new £3 billion affordable home scheme he announced is actually a re-announcement from 2017? And can he also confirm that £20 billion has been cut from the social housing grant since 2010 and that 30,000 fewer social homes are being built each year than under the last Labour government?
No, Mr. Speaker, that's not correct. The £3 billion is part of the £44 billion total package for housing that we announced. So I announced an overall framework, and I'm announcing how we will spend that money in a series of announcements.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor's statement ignores the facts and the position of Shelter, which claim that we need to build 155,000 social homes a year. Why the lack of ambition?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the total last year was over 220,000 new homes in total. That's the highest in all but one of the last 31 years. This is not about money. This is about the capacity of the industry to deliver. And we are taking steps not just to actually build houses, but to support the industry to expand, funding directly smaller and medium enterprises so that they can expand the capacity of the house building industry.
Adrian Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To end Brexit uncertainty, business wants a commitment to the customs union, frictionless access to the EU market, and the both skilled and unskilled labour that comes from it. Will the Chancellor commit to supporting a deal that delivers just that?
Mr. Speaker, I am and have since 2016 been committed to delivering a deal which allows us to continue our complex and long-established trading relationships with the European Union, our closest neighbours and most important economic partners, and I will continue to advocate for such a deal.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given a single Scottish police force was also a Scottish Tory manifesto commitment, and the economy is so good he's found extra money for policing in England and Wales. Why is he not moving towards refunding the £175 million VAT for the Scottish Police and Fire Services?
Exactly.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland will, of course, benefit from the £100 million that I've announced today through the Barnett formula. And on the question of the VAT, at the request of a group of my honourable friends, we looked at this and we did change the rules going forward. But the Scottish Government did what it did in reorganising Police Scotland in the full knowledge that it would have the VAT consequences that it did.
Heidi Allen.
That ending the benefits freeze is not just about people in work. This is about our welfare safety net. People who can't work, potentially because they're too ill, can't afford to live on the basic amount. The benefits freeze must end. The core amount of universal credit and ESA has not risen for 3 years.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've already said, the benefits freeze will end at the end of the forthcoming year. We have no intention of renewing it or prolonging it. These were difficult decisions, but they're ones that we had to take.
Debbie Abrahams.
4 babies in 1,000 will not reach their first birthday as a result of this government's austerity policies. So if the government is so keen on tackling burning injustices, why won't they end the freeze and end it now?
What is she talking about? Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear which freeze the honourable lady is talking about. Benefits. I've answered the question. The benefits freeze will end at the end of the forthcoming year.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. York schools are the worst funded in the country, and we have the highest attainment gap, and the schools in the most deprived areas have had the largest per pupil funding cut. When will the Chancellor address this huge inequality?
Well, look, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady has a legitimate point. The funding between schools and authorities is very unevenly distributed. That's why when we put an extra £1.3 billion into the school system in 2017, we committed to a fair funding formula that would redistribute over time. That is happening. I understand that for those schools that are underfunded relative to the mean at the moment, they would like it to happen more quickly, but that has to be the answer. We have to move towards a fairer distribution of funding between schools.
Mr Richard Burden.
Does the Chancellor accept that the changes he's made to vehicle excise duty penalises the cleanest diesels on the market while offering no incentive whatsoever to motorists to get rid of older, dirtier diesels? And that's led to the increase in new car emissions of CO2 for the first time in a decade. When's he going to sort this out?
No, Mr Speaker, I don't accept that, but I do accept that because of the scandal of manipulated emissions tests, we have a very difficult situation in the vehicle excise duty tables, where vehicles have turned out to have much higher emissions than was originally thought. This is an issue that we do have to address, and I've acknowledged that in the last budget, and we will address it going forward.
Thank you. Point of order. Oh, very well. Briefly. Point of order, Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are about to start a debate on the subject of a no-deal Brexit. It may be that there are members here who have business interests that might benefit from a no-deal Brexit, such as, for instance, companies involved in shorting the pound or shorting the value of shares, or may have secured payments from companies that are enthusiastic backers of a no-deal Brexit. What advice would you give to those members today in terms of how they should declare their interest?
Absolutely. Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his point of order. The short answer is that registration of interests is a matter for the judgment of each individual member. There is no precise advice that can be given to cover every eventuality. Whenever I'm asked by individual members for my advice, I say, if in doubt, if there is uncertainty, if you think someone might subsequently criticise, it is better to err on the side of over-declaration than of under-declaration. That has been my own philosophy, and I would commend it to colleagues. I hope that that is helpful. And good. No further points of order. 10-minute rule motion. Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to be given to bring a bill to establish a single custodial tenancy deposit scheme, to provide for that scheme to invest deposits, to require interest in such investments to be used for the provision of tenant advocacy, tenant support, arbitration services, and to establish a mandatory arbitration service for the resolution of disputes between landlords, tenants, and for connected purposes. I need to declare an interest. I use the current deposit scheme as a landlord for tenants. It is a system that I don't believe works for landlords, and I don't believe it provides the safeguards that the last Labour government intended with the original legislation. Mr Speaker, I'm introducing this bill today partly because of the treatment of my constituent Andy Smith, who was living in an apartment owned by Baron Homes. He had a tenancy agreement to December 2018. In January of that year, he was offered council accommodation, of which he gratefully accepted. As his tenancy required, he got the mutual agreement in writing to break his lease. So you would imagine him fulfilling all aspects of his contract, he should be entitled to his £650 back. Sadly, that was not the case. Baron Homes alleged that there was damage to the property and they would keep the entire deposit. I have seen the photos of before and after that show that the damage they allege was pre-existing and some wear and tear. And in any regard, withholding the deposit was rather bad faith because the property was to be gutted and turned into 2 luxury studio flats. Of course, Brighton does have a history of rogue landlords, Van Hoogstraten, when I was growing up, and Baron Homes today have a woeful record of exploiting tenants in our city. So, of course, it was no surprise when Baron Homes forced Andy to challenge their decision through my deposits, who are the tenancy deposit scheme that Baron Homes, of course, choose to use. Judgment Day came, and my deposits ruled that there was no damage to the property, but they claimed that Andy had broken his lease early, so Baron Homes could keep the whole deposit as punishment. I thought